Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Have you ever received an invitation to something you couldn't remember being invited to? A party, an event, a gathering of some kind, one that seems so familiar, yet you've never even heard of it before? I found the envelope on a rainy Wednesday afternoon. It was strange how it appeared in my mailbox, unmarked, no return address, just a thick cream-colored card with gold lettering. My name was written in elegant script across the front. At first, I thought it might be junk mail or some sort of advertisement. But then I saw the address on the back of the envelope. It was the address of my old house, the one I hadn't lived in for years. My chest tightened at the thought of it. That house, that neighborhood, held so many memories, some good, others that still haunted me. It wasn't a place I ever wanted to return to. But there it was, an invitation to a party at that very address. Confused, I opened the envelope, half expecting to find a mistake or a prank. But the card inside wasn't a joke. It was an elegant invitation, printed with an ornate font. You are invited to a gathering of old friends. Come join us at 7 p.m. sharp, at the address you know so well. Don't be late. The oddest thing about it was that it seemed to pull me in. I couldn't understand why, but I felt a strange pull toward that house, as though the invitation was something I had been waiting for without realizing it. I didn't want to go. I should have thrown it away, ignored it completely. But there was something insistent about it. So, I did what I knew I shouldn't. I put on my coat, grabbed my purse, and drove to the old neighborhood. The roads were slick with rain, and the familiar sight of the old houses loomed in front of me, each one indistinguishable from the next, yet each one carrying the weight of my past. My house stood at the end of the street, shrouded in shadows, its windows dark and empty. As I walked up the driveway, a strange sensation washed over me, like I was stepping back in time. The place felt so real, so familiar, but also off. The air was thick with an unfamiliar stillness, as if the house had been waiting for me to return, waiting for this moment. I rang the doorbell. The sound echoed through the quiet street, reverberating in the air like an old memory waking up. Moments passed before the door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit hallway beyond. But there was no one standing at the door. No host, no greeting. Only an open door, waiting for me to step inside. I hesitated. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to leave, to turn around and walk away, but I felt drawn in. I stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind me with a sudden, jarring noise. The house was just as I remembered it, almost too familiar. The furniture was arranged in the same way, the air smelled the same, but there was an eerie silence that made everything feel wrong. The sound of my footsteps on the wooden floor echoed through the space. "Hello?" I called out, my voice unnaturally loud in the quiet. "Is anyone here?" But there was no answer. Instead, I heard the faintest rustling from upstairs, like someone moving around in a room I couldn't see. Slowly, I climbed the stairs, my heart pounding with each step. As I reached the top of the stairs, I noticed something strange, pictures hanging on the walls. They were of people I didn't recognize, but their faces seemed oddly familiar. There was a man with dark eyes, a woman with a laugh that seemed to echo in my mind, and a child who had the same smile as my younger brother. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I didn't know these people, but somehow I felt like I had known them forever. I kept walking, drawn deeper into the house, the air growing heavier with each step. Then, at the end of the hallway, I saw it. The door to the living room was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I could see movement. People moving about, chatting, laughing. It looked like a party, just like the invitation had said. But something was wrong. I pushed the door open slowly, stepping into the room. The moment I did, I froze. The people in the room were all looking at me. They were smiling, some nodding in recognition, others waving. But I didn't know any of them. Not really. And yet, their faces, they seemed so familiar. "Come join us," a voice called out from across the room. It was a woman with short, dark hair and a friendly smile. Her eyes were filled with something I couldn't place. "We've all been waiting for you." I took a step back. The door clicked shut behind me, trapping me in the room. My heart raced and my pulse quickened. This wasn't just a party. This wasn't just an invitation. Something was wrong, something I couldn't quite grasp. But the room seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't escape, like a memory on the edge of my mind. The guests continued to smile, their faces slowly warping into something else. Something darker. Their laughter, once so inviting, now sounded hollow, like an echo from a past I didn't understand. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just a party. It was a trap. My feet felt like they were glued to the floor. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The guests' eyes were fixed on me now, their smiles stretching unnaturally wide, as if they were expecting something. Something I couldn't understand. "Come join us," the woman with dark hair said again, her voice carrying a strange weight. "We've been waiting." I looked around the room, trying to make sense of it all. The furniture, the walls, the dim lighting, it was all so familiar, yet it felt like I was standing in the wrong place, at the wrong time. A place that was only half real. A chill ran down my spine. I turned toward the door, but it was no longer where it had been. The hallway I had just walked down seemed to have vanished, swallowed by the room. The walls had closed in, and now the room felt smaller, suffocating. The laughter from the guests grew louder, but it wasn't warm or inviting anymore. It was sharp, as if they were mocking me. I took a tentative step back, my mind screaming at me to leave, but my body refused to cooperate. I felt as though someone, was holding me in place. A force beyond my control, pressing down on me. "Why are you so scared?" a man asked, his voice soft but full of an unnerving curiosity. His face was too smooth, his eyes too wide. "You remember this place, don't you?" I nodded without thinking, my throat dry. I didn't know these people, but there was something undeniably familiar about them, like I had seen them in a dream, or perhaps in another life. I couldn't place it, but I knew deep down that this was no ordinary party. "Yes, I remember," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Then join us," the woman said again, her eyes narrowing slightly, as though she were reading my every thought. Something flickered in the corner of my eye. A shadow. A figure. But when I looked, there was nothing there. It was as if it had been erased the moment I turned my head. The room seemed to stretch out around me, the guests moving like shadows, their faces shifting, becoming blurry. I blinked, trying to clear the fog that had settled over my mind. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick with the scent of something old, something decayed. It clung to the back of my throat, choking me. Panic surged through my chest, and I tried to take a step toward the door, but my legs refused to move. It was like wading through molasses, my body growing heavier with each second. "Don't leave," the man's voice came again, this time much closer. I spun around to see him standing right behind me, his face inches from mine. His breath was cold, and his eyes were too deep. Too empty. "You're not ready to leave yet." I staggered backward, finally finding my legs again. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears, my chest tightening with each desperate breath. The woman with dark hair tilted her head slightly, watching me with a strange, knowing look. "You've forgotten," she said softly. "But you will remember soon. All of us, we've been waiting." A low, distorted hum filled the room, like the sound of electricity crackling through the air. My vision blurred as the walls around me seemed to bend and twist, as if the very structure of the house was alive, pulsing, shifting. A cold draft swept through the room, making the hairs on my arms stand on end. And then I heard it. A faint sound. A whisper. It was my name. "Claire," the voice hissed, barely audible over the rising noise. "You're not supposed to be here." My head snapped around, searching for the source of the whisper. The guests continued to smile at me, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light, but the whisper, my name, came again. This time louder, more insistent. I turned toward the window, but there was nothing outside. Just the reflection of the room. The same room that felt so wrong, so out of place. The figures in the reflection, their faces were no longer just blurry, they were twisted, grotesque. And then, in the reflection, I saw something else. A shadowy figure, tall and thin, standing in the doorway of the living room. It wasn't one of the guests. Its form was almost human, but its features were blurred, obscured by darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as it took a step forward. The noise in the room intensified, as if the very walls were vibrating with the presence of this figure. "Leave," the whisper echoed, now a sharp, guttural command. "You're not meant to be here." I could feel the ground beneath me shifting, the room tilting slightly as though I were on the edge of a cliff. The door was still closed, the shadows still watching. But the figure in the reflection, the one standing at the doorway, was now moving toward me. It was coming closer. Closer. I forced my legs to move, to take a step toward the door, but my feet felt like they were stuck in cement. The guests were still watching, their smiles widening, their eyes glowing brighter. Suddenly, the door behind me creaked open, and I didn't hesitate. I bolted toward it, pushing past the guests, ignoring the faint whispers that called my name. The air was thick with something I couldn't quite place, and the figure in the doorway was right behind me now, its presence a cold weight pressing against my back. I slammed the door shut behind me, and for a moment there was silence. But I knew I hadn't escaped. The house, the party, was still there, lurking in the corners of my mind. And I had no idea if I had truly left or if I was still trapped, caught between two worlds. The invitation had come for a reason. And now, I had no choice but to find out why. The silence outside the room felt suffocating, as though the very air itself was pressing against me, unwilling to let me go. My heart still raced in my chest, and my breath came in ragged gasps. I glanced around, trying to get my bearings, but nothing felt right. I was in a hallway now, but it wasn't one I recognized. The walls seemed too clean, too pristine, yet there was a coldness to them that made my skin crawl. The floor beneath my feet was polished wood, gleaming under the dim light of an old chandelier that hung above. I could still hear the faint hum of the party in the distance. The muffled laughter, the clinking of glasses, the music, a twisted melody that seemed to echo in my ears like it was coming from a place far away, yet it felt too close, too real. I pressed my hand to my forehead, trying to steady myself, trying to make sense of it all. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that nothing made sense. I should have been home, safe, sitting on my couch and reading a book. But instead, I was here, somewhere I didn't want to be. Somewhere I didn't understand. I had to leave. But every direction I looked, every hallway I turned down, felt like it was leading me further into the unknown. The house seemed to stretch on endlessly, with no clear way out. I took a deep breath and turned back toward the door, but it was no longer there. The hallway stretched out in front of me, bending and twisting like a maze, with no sign of the exit. The whisper came again. "Claire." This time, the voice wasn't soft. It wasn't a whisper of curiosity or warning. It was a command, deep and guttural, coming from the walls themselves. I froze. The hallway seemed to pulse around me, like the heartbeat of a living thing. I spun around, expecting to see someone or something, but there was no one. Just the endless stretch of empty space. "Claire," the voice called again, but this time it was closer. Much closer. I stumbled backward, my feet slipping on the smooth floor. I grabbed the nearest wall to steady myself, and that's when I saw it, an old mirror, standing at the far end of the hall. The reflection was distorted, warped, as if the glass itself was bending under pressure. I hesitated, but then something in the reflection caught my eye. A shadow. A figure. But it wasn't just any figure, it was me. The reflection of me in the mirror looked different. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, staring back at me with an expression of pure terror. She was trying to speak, but no sound came from her lips. And then, she moved. She raised a hand, slowly, and pointed directly at me. I gasped and stumbled back, my pulse thundering in my ears. The figure in the mirror was no longer just an image. It was real. It was here with me. The walls of the hallway began to shift again, the space narrowing, growing smaller, until I felt as if I were trapped in some kind of nightmare. My breath came in short, sharp bursts as I backed away from the mirror, but I couldn't escape. "Claire," the voice hissed from all around me now. "You are not supposed to leave." I spun around, but the hallway was gone. In its place was a dark, empty void, blackness that swallowed everything around me. And then, in the distance, I saw the familiar silhouette of the party guests again. They were standing in the same position as before, their eyes glowing with that same eerie light, waiting for me to return. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to move. The fear was so overwhelming, so consuming, that I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. I was caught between two worlds now, one where I had never left, and one where I could never return. The guests' faces shifted, like shadows flickering in the dim light. They were watching me, waiting for me to come back, to rejoin them. "Join us," the woman with dark hair called out again, her voice growing louder. "You can never leave, Claire. You belong here." Her words were like chains, wrapping around me, pulling me toward them. But every part of me screamed to resist, to fight against the invisible force that was pushing me back toward the party. "Stop!" I shouted, though my voice was weak, hoarse. "This isn't real. None of this is real." But the laughter only grew louder, more oppressive. It wasn't friendly anymore. It wasn't warm or inviting. It was mocking. It was cold. The figure in the mirror, the distorted version of me, stepped out of the reflection, its eyes empty, hollow, and its movements jerky, unnatural. I could feel the darkness closing in. The shadows were reaching for me, pulling me toward them. I had to wake up. I had to escape. But no matter how much I struggled, no matter how hard I fought, I couldn't escape the pull of the party. The figure was closer now, its fingers almost touching my shoulder, when suddenly the world around me went black. I woke up, gasping for air, as though I had been underwater for too long. My chest was tight, my hands trembling uncontrollably. The familiar hum of the city, the soft murmur of the world outside my window, filled the room. I was back in my apartment, safe, or at least I thought I was. For a moment, I simply lay there, drenched in sweat, trying to make sense of the dream, or was it a dream? The images of the mirror, the figures, the overwhelming sense of being trapped, still haunted me. I could almost feel the cold fingers of that shadow on my skin, the eerie laughter that echoed in my ears. I rubbed my eyes, willing the nightmare to fade, but it lingered like a fog in the back of my mind. The clock on the wall read 5 in the morning. I had only been asleep for a few hours. The events of the night, the party, the strange guests, they felt too vivid to be just a dream. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my feet touching the cold hardwood floor. My heart still raced, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I turned to the desk where I had left my phone the night before. It was silent, its screen dark. No messages. No calls. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before unlocking it. My thumb hovered over the screen as if anticipating something. Then I saw it. An email notification. The subject line read, "Invitation to the party." My breath caught in my throat. The words on the screen were blurry for a moment, but as I focused, I could feel my hands grow colder. The sender was unknown, but the email body was unmistakable. "We are waiting for you, Claire. You can't escape this time. Come back to where you belong." The message sent a chill down my spine. I stared at it, unable to move, as if the words themselves had paralyzed me. The email contained an address. I recognized it immediately. It was my old home, the house I had grown up in before I left. I slammed the phone down, my hands shaking as I fought to breathe. It wasn't possible. I had left that house years ago. It had been sold. Someone else lived there now. There was no way the party could be happening there. But the eerie truth lingered. How had the sender known where I used to live? How could they know about me? I stood up, pacing around the room, trying to steady my racing thoughts. The dream, or whatever it had been, wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was connected to something real. Something I couldn't explain. I glanced out the window. The sky was still dark, but the first light of dawn was beginning to creep in. My mind was a tangled mess of confusion and dread, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't pretend this was just a bad dream. The party. The invitation. The people I didn't recognize, yet felt I knew. I grabbed my jacket, ignoring the nervous knot in my stomach. I had to see it for myself. I had to find out what was happening. I stepped out into the cold morning air, the streets quiet, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting. The further I walked, the more the dread in my chest grew. I had no idea what awaited me at that address, but it felt like the answer to everything I'd been running from. It didn't take long to reach the neighborhood, but something was off. The streets were quieter than usual. The houses all seemed to blur together, indistinguishable from one another. But then I saw it. My old house. It stood there, perfectly preserved, just as I remembered it. The red brick, the large front windows, the overgrown ivy creeping up the side of the house. But it was different, too. It was darker, almost oppressive, as if it were alive, watching me approach. A flicker of movement in the window caught my eye, but when I looked closer, it was gone. I hesitated at the gate. The feeling of being drawn toward the house was overwhelming, as if the place itself was calling to me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I shouldn't go inside. Something about this didn't feel right. I stood there for a long moment, trying to steady my nerves, but my feet moved on their own. I crossed the gate and walked up the path toward the door. The closer I got, the more I could hear. A faint murmur of voices, like whispers carried on the wind. Laughter. A soft melody playing from somewhere inside. The sounds from the party that had haunted my dreams now filled the air, and with every step, they grew louder. I reached the door and paused, my hand hovering above the doorknob. The whispers grew more frantic, as if they were calling me, urging me to open it. The door was unlocked. I stepped inside. The door creaked as it swung open, the sound echoing in the stillness of the hallway. I stepped into the house, the familiar smell of old wood and dust filling my nostrils. For a moment, everything was exactly as I remembered. Nothing had changed. The same old carpet on the floor, the same paintings on the walls, the same creaky staircase leading upstairs. But something felt different. Something was off. The air in the house was thick, heavy, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something. The party sounds were louder now, almost as if they were coming from the house itself, seeping through the walls. I tried to shake the sensation, but it clung to me like a second skin. I turned toward the living room, where the noise seemed to be coming from. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of the chandelier casting long shadows across the furniture. But the strangest thing was that the people, no, the figures standing in the room, were all facing me. Their faces were obscured by the shadows, but I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. I stepped forward, my breath catching in my throat as I recognized them. They were all people from my past, people I hadn't seen in years. But there was something wrong. Their faces were too still, too perfect, as if they were frozen in time. There was Emily, my childhood friend, standing near the fireplace, her eyes wide and unblinking. To the left of her, Mark, my old neighbor, who had always been so full of life, except now, he was eerily silent. They were all there, people I had known, people I had forgotten. But they weren't smiling. They weren't laughing. They were waiting. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped further into the room, the shadows stretching unnaturally as I passed. The sound of the party, the music, the laughter, everything seemed to fade away until it was just me and the figures standing in the room. Then, from behind me, I heard a voice. Soft, familiar, but twisted with an edge of something I couldn't quite place. Claire, you've finally come back. I spun around, my blood running cold. There, standing at the door, was a man I didn't recognize. His eyes were dark, hollow, and his face was covered in a mask of familiarity that made my skin crawl. He smiled, but it wasn't a smile I remembered. It was different. Hello. I've been waiting for you, he continued, his voice smooth, almost hypnotic. I took a step back, my mind racing. My heart was in my throat, the room closing in on me. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. My body was frozen in place. Who are you? I whispered, the words barely leaving my lips. What is this? The man's smile widened, and the others in the room slowly started to turn toward me, their eyes following my every movement. The atmosphere grew thicker, heavier, as if the house itself was coming alive. You don't remember, do you? He said, taking a step closer. This is where it all began. This is where you belong. I tried to take another step back, but I was trapped. The walls seemed to close in, and the shadows around me stretched farther, twisting, reaching for me. I felt their cold touch against my skin, but when I looked, there was nothing there. I turned toward the window, hoping for a way out, but the scene outside had changed. The streets were empty, the sky a deep, unnatural red, and the world seemed to have distorted itself, folding in on itself like an old photograph burning at the edges. The man laughed, a low, mocking sound that made my skin crawl. You can't escape, Claire. You've been here all along. We've all been waiting for you to return. I wanted to scream, to run, but it was as if the house had a hold on me. My feet felt rooted to the floor, my body a prisoner of the darkness that seemed to press in on all sides. The laughter grew louder, filling my ears, drowning out everything else. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the figures stepped forward. One by one, they advanced, moving like shadows, their eyes never leaving mine. Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut. I spun around, but it was too late. I was trapped. The man in the mask took another step forward, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. You should have never come back, Claire. Now, you'll never leave. The room seemed to close in on me, the shadows reaching out to pull me into their cold embrace. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. My body, my mind, it was all shutting down, consumed by the darkness. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The laughter, the whispers, the shadows, everything. I stood there, in the middle of the room, alone. The silence was deafening. The world outside was still, as if nothing had happened. As if I had imagined it all. But when I turned toward the door, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A single, red invitation lay on the floor, just inside the entrance. It had my name on it. It's strange how sometimes, without any warning, we make decisions that end up changing everything. One afternoon, I was on my way home, tired from the long walk, when I noticed a field to my right. It looked peaceful, calm, almost inviting. It was a vast stretch of green, with just a dirt path cutting through it. I knew it wasn't much of a shortcut, but something told me to take it. Have you ever had that feeling? A tiny voice whispering to you, urging you to do something you wouldn't normally do? Well, I listened to that voice. I stepped off the main road and into the field. The grass whispered as I walked, brushing against my legs, the sound oddly soothing. The air was cool, with just a hint of moisture that clung to the skin. I didn't think much of it at first, just a quiet, peaceful walk in the middle of nowhere. The field was vast, stretching for miles in every direction, with no sign of anything ahead. The path was uneven, sometimes barely visible, and the further I went, the more I started to feel like I was being pulled into something. A shadow moved across the field, something that wasn't quite the shape of a cloud. It was so faint I thought it was just a trick of the light. The path seemed to stretch on forever, but there was something off about it. The way the grass bent, the way the ground shifted underfoot, it didn't feel normal. And then, I saw it. A house. At first, I thought I must have imagined it. There had been nothing in the field when I started walking. But now, there it was, standing in the distance, half hidden by the tall grass. The house looked old, abandoned. It wasn't something that belonged in the middle of a quiet field. The roof sagged in places, the windows boarded up. It was as though it had been forgotten by time itself. I paused for a moment, the air around me suddenly colder, a feeling of unease settling in my stomach. Something about the place felt wrong, like it was out of place in this vast, empty field. But curiosity got the better of me, and before I knew it, I was walking toward the house. The closer I got, the more I noticed details. The once white walls had faded to a dull gray, the paint chipped and peeling. The door was slightly ajar, creaking on its hinges as if welcoming me. The silence was heavy, oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of the wind through the grass. I stood at the doorway for a moment, unsure whether I should go inside. But the thought of turning back felt even stranger. The air around me felt thick, like the house was pulling me in. I couldn't resist. I stepped inside. The smell hit me first, dust, old wood, and something else. Something faint, like something I couldn't quite place. The floor creaked under my feet as I took a few cautious steps. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and I could see more clearly now. The inside of the house was bare, save for a few scattered objects. Old furniture, covered in sheets, stood in the corners. A rocking chair by the window, motionless. A broken lamp on the floor. It looked like someone had just walked away, leaving everything behind. But it wasn't the emptiness that made me uneasy. It was what I found next. Near the center of the room, in the far corner, was a box. Small, wooden, and old. I don't know why I felt drawn to it, but I did. I crouched down and carefully opened it. Inside were toys. Children's toys, dolls, toy cars, blocks, all carefully arranged as if they were waiting to be played with again. But the thing that made my heart skip was that they were all familiar. I had owned them once. My own toys from childhood. The dolls with missing eyes, the worn-out cars, the blocks with letters I had long forgotten. They were mine. I felt a chill run down my spine. How could they be here? I hadn't seen these toys in years. Not since I was a child. Not since. The silence in the house deepened, and I felt a pressure on my chest, a feeling of being watched. I turned around, expecting to see someone standing behind me. But there was no one. Just the toys. I took a few shaky steps back from the box, trying to shake off the unease that was spreading through me. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't explain why. It was just a box of old toys. But something about them, something about the way they had been placed there in such a familiar arrangement, felt wrong. I glanced around the room, the dim light casting long shadows against the walls. The air was thick with dust, and the silence was almost suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in this house. I stood there, still as a statue, listening intently. There it was again. A faint sound, just barely audible over the stillness. A whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind. But it wasn't. The sound was too deliberate, too close. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to hear. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. The whisper stopped. For a moment, everything was still. The silence was deafening, and I felt the weight of it pressing down on me. I waited, my muscles tense, my eyes darting around the room. There was no movement, no sign of anyone or anything. And then I heard it again. This time, clearer. It was coming from behind me. "Don't leave." The voice was soft, almost a breath. It was unmistakably human. I spun around, my eyes wide, searching the corners of the room for any sign of movement. But the room was empty. The toys in the box still sat there, untouched. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My pulse quickened, and the air seemed to grow colder by the second. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I was just scared of being alone in this strange, abandoned house. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. There was something else here. Something that didn't want me to leave. I glanced back at the door. The way out. But it felt so far away, like a dream. Something told me I wouldn't make it out if I left. That I would be trapped here, in this house with whatever it was. But I couldn't stay. I couldn't let this thing, whatever it was, control me. I turned toward the door, taking a step forward, but my foot caught on something. I stumbled, catching myself against the wall. I looked down. There, on the floor, was one of the toys, a small wooden block. It had rolled toward me as if pushed by an unseen hand. I bent down to pick it up, my fingers trembling. It was smooth, worn from years of use, and when I flipped it over, I saw something carved into the wood. A name. My name. My heart stopped. I dropped the block, the sound of it hitting the floor echoing through the room. My breath was shallow, panic rising in my chest. I knew that name. I had written it there when I was a child. But I hadn't seen this block in years. Not since. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the house, shaking the walls. The floor beneath my feet trembled. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, my body paralyzed with fear. The noise was coming from upstairs, a series of heavy footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving closer. "Don't leave," the voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't just behind me. It was everywhere. I turned toward the door, but the path back seemed longer than before. The walls were closing in, and the house felt alive. I could hear the footsteps now, the creaking of the floorboards above me, growing louder with every passing second. I had to get out. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move, stepping toward the door. My legs felt heavy, like they were moving through thick mud. The footsteps above me were closer now, and the whispering had become a low murmur, like 1,000 voices surrounding me. I reached the door, my hand trembling as I grabbed the handle. But as I tried to turn it, the door wouldn't budge. It was stuck. Panic surged through me. I pulled harder, but it wouldn't open. The voices were louder now, almost deafening. And then, a shadow moved across the doorway. I froze. It was just a flicker, something I saw out of the corner of my eye. But it was enough. I knew I wasn't alone. The shadow lingered in the doorway, dark and undefined, as if it was waiting for me to acknowledge it. I could feel its presence, like it was pressing in on me from all sides, even though I couldn't see it clearly. My heart raced in my chest, and the whispering grew louder, turning into a chorus of voices. Some were pleading, others commanding. But all of them had the same message. Stay. I pulled at the door handle again, desperate to escape. But it still wouldn't open. The door, once seemingly normal, now felt like it had been sealed shut by something far stronger than simple wood and iron. I turned toward the room, searching for any other way out. The windows were too high, and the walls felt too thick to break through. But then, the shadow in the doorway shifted. It moved, slowly and deliberately, as though it was becoming more solid with every step it took. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure, if you could even call it that, was tall, its form vague and formless at first. The edges of it seemed to blur into the darkness of the house. I could make out no distinct features, but there was a sense of something human. Or at least, something that had once been human. It was wearing what looked like a tattered coat, its sleeves hanging loosely as if the body inside had been lost to time. The face, or where the face should have been, was a hollow void, a space filled with nothing but darkness. I could feel its eyes, though. They were there, in the emptiness of its face, and they were fixed on me. I tried to move, to step back, but my feet felt frozen to the floor. It was as if the air around me had thickened, trapping me in place. The whispers intensified, growing louder, becoming frantic. The shadow moved closer, its presence now almost tangible. "Don't leave, stay with us." The words crawled under my skin, sending a chill down my spine. The figure stretched out its hand, its fingers long and unnaturally thin, reaching for me. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath now, puffing out in white clouds. I had to get out. I had to escape. But every movement felt heavier, like I was wading through thick fog. I pulled against the door handle once more, my knuckles turning white. The figure took another step forward, its voice now more distinct, a low hiss that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. "Join us." And then, with a sudden force, the door burst open. I stumbled backward, the door slamming against the wall with a deafening bang. I didn't hesitate. I ran. I bolted down the narrow hallway, my heart pounding in my ears. Behind me, I could hear the floor creaking, the footsteps following. They were fast now, faster than I could run. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing there, just the dark, empty house. Yet the sound of the footsteps grew louder, closer. I reached the stairs and didn't think twice. I ran up them, 2 steps at a time, desperate to get away. But as I reached the top, I skidded to a halt. The hallway stretched out before me, but it was different. It wasn't the same hallway I had seen before. The walls were lined with framed photographs, all faded and old. But it wasn't just the pictures that unsettled me. The faces in them, they were all wrong. They were faces I didn't recognize, but they were watching me, their eyes following my every move. In some of the frames, there were children. In others, families, all smiling, yet their smiles felt empty, forced. The footsteps behind me grew louder, more insistent. I had no choice but to keep moving. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, but as I did, the door at the end of the hall creaked open by itself. There was a soft, beckoning sound coming from the room beyond. It was a familiar sound. A child's laughter. I shouldn't have gone closer. I knew that. But I did. The closer I got, the more the laughter echoed, growing louder, almost frantic. My heart raced, and every step felt like a mistake. I reached the doorway, and I could feel the presence behind me, the shadow creeping closer, following my every movement. I stepped into the room. It was empty, except for a single rocking chair in the center. The chair was moving, rocking back and forth slowly, creaking in the silence. There were no windows, No doors, just four walls closing in on me. And then the laughter stopped. The room was dead silent. I could hear nothing except my own breathing. The chair stopped rocking. And then something changed. The toys, the same ones from the box downstairs, were here, strewn across the floor. Dolls, blocks, cars. All of them like they had been waiting for me. But there was something else now. A figure, small and childlike, sitting in the corner. It was hunched over, its back to me. The air grew colder, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck rising. It turned slowly, and I recognized it. It was me. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I thought I was dreaming. The figure in the corner, it was me. Or at least, it looked like me. The same height, the same messy hair, the same worn clothes. But something was horribly off. The figure's eyes were wide, empty, and its face had no expression, just a blank stare that seemed to pierce through me. I felt a cold sweat break out of my skin, my heart pounding in my chest. "No," I whispered, backing away slowly. "This isn't possible." The figure didn't move, just stared at me, as though waiting for something. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. It felt like the very air around me was closing in, choking the life out of me. And then it spoke. "Why did you leave?" The voice was my own. But it was hollow, empty, lacking the warmth of a human tone. It was like hearing a distant echo of myself, a voice from a place I couldn't reach. I swallowed hard. "What are you?" The figure didn't answer, but its expression seemed to shift ever so slightly. It tilted its head, as if considering my question. The air was thick with tension. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in on me as if they were closing, trapping me with this thing. I couldn't look away. It was like some invisible force was holding my gaze locked with that empty stare. My body screamed to move, but my mind was caught in a strange paralysis. "Why did you leave?" The voice repeated, louder this time, almost desperate. "We were waiting. You left us, and now you're here. But you're too late." The room around me seemed to grow darker. The air felt heavier, colder. I looked down at the floor, noticing that the toys were scattered around the figure, but there was something else too. There, lying in the middle of the room, was a small, withered photograph. My hands trembled as I bent down to pick it up. It was a picture of me as a child. A happy picture, or so it seemed at first. But as I stared at the photo, I realized something was wrong. The background was blurry, out of focus. And in the corner, just out of sight, there was a figure, one that hadn't been there when I had taken the photo. It was a shadow, barely visible, but unmistakable. It was the same shadow that had been following me from the moment I stepped into the house. The same figure I had seen at the door. The laughter returned, faint but unmistakable. It was a child's laughter, the kind that should have been innocent, but now it sounded twisted, mocking. I backed away from the figure in the corner, my feet moving on their own now, driven by pure instinct. I had to get out. I had to escape. The door, the hallway, it was all I could think about. The figure's voice rang in my ears as I turned to run. "You can't leave," it said. "Not this time." I reached for the door, my hand trembling, and as I turned the handle, I felt it. A cold, invisible hand wrapping around my wrist, holding me in place. My heart raced as I yanked my arm, trying to break free. But the grip tightened like fingers made of ice, pulling me back into the room. No! I gasped, struggling against the unseen force. I won't stay. I won't. I managed to break free for a moment, my hand pushing the door open just enough to escape. But then, I felt it. The ground beneath me gave way. The floorboards cracked, and a cold gust of wind blew through the room, knocking me off balance. I fell to the ground, the sound of the house groaning in protest. The walls shook. The shadow in the corner seemed to shift, stretching and growing, its form becoming clearer. It wasn't a child anymore. It was something else. Something far darker. Too late. The voice echoed, now all around me, no longer just from the figure. It was coming from the walls, from the ceiling, from the very floor beneath me. You're one of us now. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing. I had to get out. I had to break free before it was too late. The door slammed shut in front of me with a deafening crash. I turned, panic rising in my chest, and saw it coming toward me. It was me. Or something that looked like me. The eyes, empty and hollow, stared back at me, and it reached out, its hand like a claw, cold and grasping. Join us, it whispered, its voice growing louder, more frantic. We've been waiting. The walls seemed to close in around me. The air grew thick with shadows, and I felt the world spinning, the floor shifting beneath me. My breath came in ragged gasps as the figure reached out for me, its fingers curling toward my throat. But just as it touched me, everything stopped. A silence. A stillness. I was falling, but it felt different. Like time had frozen, like the very essence of reality had snapped. And then, there was only darkness. When I woke up, I was outside. I was standing in the middle of the field, the house nowhere in sight. The sky was clear, the air calm. The path stretched ahead of me, just as I had remembered it. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling. Had it all been a dream? A nightmare? But then, I saw something in the distance, standing at the edge of the field. It was a figure. The same one. It was me. I stood frozen in place, my breath hitching as I stared at the figure in the distance. It was unmistakable, my own reflection, standing there at the edge of the field, facing me. My heart pounded, and I tried to move, to run, but my body refused to respond. It was like I was trapped in a dream, caught between waking and sleep. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its silhouette framed against the horizon. I could see its face now, my face, but the expression was different. It was empty, void of any emotion, as if it wasn't truly me, but something that had taken my place. I took a step forward, my feet heavy, reluctant. The wind blew gently through the field, but there was something wrong about the stillness around me. It felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. I called out, but the sound of my voice felt distant, swallowed by the emptiness. "Who are you?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "What do you want from me?" The figure didn't speak. It just stood there, waiting. Its eyes, my eyes, seemed to draw me in, pulling me toward it with an invisible force. I tried to resist, to turn away, but something inside me urged me forward. As I took another step, the ground beneath me shifted. The field, once so familiar, now seemed foreign, like it was shifting into something else. The sky above darkened, and I could see clouds gathering on the horizon. The wind grew colder, the air thick with tension. The figure began to move. It took a step toward me, slow and deliberate, its gaze never leaving mine. The closer it got, the more I could feel the weight of its presence, like it was a part of me, but not a part one recognized. It was as if it had always been there, lurking just beyond the surface of my mind, waiting for the right moment to emerge. I stopped, unable to move any further. My feet were rooted to the ground, and my heart pounded in my chest. The figure was only a few feet away now. I could see it clearly, the tattered clothes, the pale skin, the eyes, those hollow eyes. It reached out, its hand stretching toward me, its fingers cold and unnaturally long. I could feel the air around it grow colder, the space between us thick with dread. "Join us," it whispered again, its voice like my own but twisted, hollow. The words echoed in my mind, and I felt the pull. It was so familiar, so real, and yet it was wrong. I had been here before, in that house, with that voice, those eyes. I had felt it then, whatever it was, and now it was here, with me, in the field. I wanted to scream, to run, to wake up from this nightmare, but my body refused to obey. The figure's hand hovered just inches from my face, and I could feel its cold, creeping touch, as though it was seeping into my very soul. Don't come any closer," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But the figure didn't stop. It kept coming, closer and closer, until its cold fingers brushed against my cheek. In that instant, everything went black. I didn't know how much time passed. Seconds? Hours? It was impossible to tell. When I opened my eyes again, I was back in the house. The house. It was dark now, the familiar silence settling in around me like a thick fog. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been touched in years. The toys were still scattered on the floor, the same as before. But something was different. The room felt heavier. The walls seemed to be closing in, and the whispering was louder now, a constant murmur just beneath the surface. I was back. But I wasn't alone. The figure was there again, standing in the doorway. Its eyes, my eyes, locked onto mine, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. It didn't speak this time. It just stood there, watching me with that same hollow expression. I wanted to run. I wanted to escape. But my body wouldn't move. It was like I was rooted to the spot, caught in a web of fear and confusion. "Why did you leave?" the figure asked again, its voice filled with an almost pleading tone. "We were waiting." I didn't answer. I couldn't. And then, slowly, the room began to shift. The walls blurred, the floor twisted beneath my feet, and the toys seemed to grow larger, their faces twisted in grotesque mockeries of childhood innocence. The laughter returned, faint at first, but growing louder, echoing off the walls, filling the room with an eerie, unsettling sound. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The figure reached out again, its hand stretching toward me, and I realized, with a terrible clarity, what it wanted. It wanted me to stay. It wanted me to be one of them. And then, I understood. I wasn't the one who had left. I had always been here, a part of this place, a part of the cycle that had begun long before I had ever stepped foot in that field. The house had never let me go. It had been waiting for me to return, to come back to where I truly belonged. And now, there was no escape. The figure stepped forward, its hand brushing against my skin, and in that moment, I knew. I was no longer just a visitor. I had become a part of the house. Have you ever felt like something just wasn't quite right, even when everything seemed fine on the surface? That's how I felt when I moved into my new apartment. The walls were freshly painted, the floors polished, and the air was clean with the scent of new furniture. But despite all of that, there was something lingering, something in the silence, the stillness of the place. It wasn't obvious at first, but as the days passed, I began to feel it more acutely. The apartment was too quiet. I had bought this place hoping to escape the hustle and bustle of the city. The thought of having my own space was a dream, but it was one that quickly began to unravel. It was the renovations, simple things, really. A new coat of paint here, some repairs there, but it was during those renovations that I began to notice odd things. It started with a small, almost insignificant thing. I was unpacking my books when I found a note wedged between the walls in the small bedroom. It was folded neatly, yellowed with age, but the handwriting was clear. Don't open the door at midnight. Something is waiting. At first, I thought it was a prank, some kind of joke left by a previous tenant. But the paper had an old, musty smell to it, and there was something in the way the ink was smeared, as though it had been handled multiple times over the years. I laughed it off, tossed the note aside, and continued my unpacking. But the words stayed with me. As I continued working on the apartment, I found more notes, small, hidden scraps of paper, tucked behind furniture, hidden in the baseboards, tucked into the seams of the floorboards. Each note carried a chilling message. It is in the walls. Don't listen to the whispers. They will come after dark. They don't like light. You're not alone. They've been here for years. I couldn't understand it. At first, I thought someone was messing with me, maybe the contractors or the previous owner who had clearly done some work in this place before I moved in. But the more I read, the more I began to feel a strange unease settle in my stomach. These notes weren't just warnings, they were a plea for help, a cry from someone who had experienced something terrible. I started noticing odd noises in the apartment. The creak of the floorboards at night, the soft rustling of paper from behind the walls. At first, it seemed like the house settling, the natural creaks and groans of an old building. But then it happened again and again until it was impossible to ignore. The whispers. At first, they were faint, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But as the days went on, they grew louder, more distinct. I couldn't understand the words, but I could feel their urgency, their dread. One evening, as I sat in the living room reading, I heard it again. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the scratch of a pencil on paper. I turned to the wall. Nothing. The apartment was silent. But my skin prickled, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was watching me. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. The whispers. Louder this time, closer. It was as though the voices were right behind the wall, just beyond my reach. I sat up, heart racing, listening intently. The words were clearer now, though I still couldn't make them out. They seemed to be calling to me. Come closer. Don't leave. It's too late for you. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. The next morning, I decided to dig deeper. I started tearing up the floors, prying up the boards where I had found the notes. I was determined to find the source of those whispers. As I removed the first few boards, the air in the room grew cold. The whispers stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. My breath fogged in front of me, and I felt a sudden chill crawl down my spine. I had to keep going. Underneath the floor, I found something strange. Not a nest of wires, not pipes, but a small wooden box, old and cracked with age. I hesitated for a moment, then pulled it out, my fingers trembling. It was sealed shut with a layer of dust, as though it hadn't been touched in decades. I couldn't ignore it. I opened the box. Inside were more notes. Dozens of them. I pulled one out, my hand shaking, and read the words written on it. They are watching. You shouldn't have opened this. Suddenly, the room felt colder. The whispers returned, this time clearer, sharper, echoing through the walls. My heart raced as I looked around. The apartment no longer felt like my home. It felt haunted. And then I heard it. A sound behind me. Not a whisper, but a scraping, like something being dragged across the floor. Slowly, I turned around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty, silent apartment. I felt the air shift, and it hit me. Something was in the walls, and it was watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the apartment anymore. The silence between the whispers had become unbearable. The air felt thick with something unspoken, like a heavy presence hovering just out of sight. The notes, the strange box I had found, the eerie scraping sound, it all connected. But how? I couldn't make sense of it. Over the next few days, the whispers grew louder, more persistent. They seemed to come from all directions, as if the very walls were alive, pulsating with some hidden force. At night, they became unbearable, always the same, soft murmurs of words I couldn't quite decipher, but they were growing clearer, more demanding. Come closer. You can hear us. The words echoed in my head as I tried to sleep, each one sharp and insistent. I clutched the blanket tightly, but it didn't help. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the oppressive weight of the apartment pressing in on me. It was as if the building itself was alive, watching, waiting. The next morning, I decided to investigate further. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Someone was trying to tell me something. Maybe it was the builder, maybe it was the last tenant, or perhaps it was something older, something buried deep within the bones of the apartment. Whatever it was, I needed answers. I started looking at the walls more closely. There had to be more clues hidden, more notes I hadn't found yet. I moved furniture, pulled up carpets, checked behind every fixture. But the more I searched, the more I realized something. The apartment didn't want me to find anything. There were no more notes, no more hidden objects, just empty spaces. And yet, the whispers continued. They followed me, no matter where I went in the apartment. They were in the corners, under the floorboards, behind the walls. They were everywhere. I sat down, my back against the wall, trying to steady my breath. I didn't know what to do. I was on the verge of giving up when I noticed something strange. A faint outline on the wall, a patch of paint that didn't quite match the rest of the room. It was subtle, but it was there. I stood up, my pulse racing, and reached for the paint. As I rubbed it, the outline grew clearer, and I realized it wasn't just a stain or a smudge. It was a door. A small door hidden beneath layers of paint. But it wasn't a normal door. It was much smaller, as though it had been built to remain hidden, to be forgotten. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I hesitated for a moment, the whispers growing louder in my ears. I knew I shouldn't open it. I knew I should turn around and leave, but the pull was too strong. I couldn't resist. With a deep breath, I pried at the edges of the door. The wood was old and brittle, but it gave way with a creak, revealing a narrow passage behind it. My heart pounded as I stared into the darkness beyond the door. I had no idea what I would find, but I knew, without a doubt, that I had to go in. The passage was tight, the air stale and heavy with the scent of mildew. I took one step forward, then another, my footsteps echoing in the small space. The further I went, the colder it became. The walls were damp, and the air was thick with dust, but the whispers, they were clearer now, almost as if they were guiding me forward. Closer. Don't stop. We're waiting. I shivered, my breath catching in my throat. I moved deeper into the passage, my hands trembling as I reached out to touch the walls. There was something strange about them, something off. The walls weren't just made of wood or stone, they felt different, like they were made of something else entirely. Suddenly, the passage opened up into a small room. The walls were lined with more notes, torn pieces of paper, scribbled with frantic messages, all the same. Don't trust them. Leave before it's too late. They're coming for you. I picked up one of the notes, my hand shaking as I read it. It was the same as the others, but this time the handwriting was different, more urgent, more frantic. We tried to warn you. Don't listen to them. They're not human. I froze. The room felt colder now, the air pressing on me like a vice. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a new sound, the sound of movement, the sound of something dragging itself closer. I turned quickly, my heart racing. The passage behind me was empty, but I could feel something, someone, was there. I wasn't alone anymore. The floorboards creaked beneath me, and I realized, too late, that I wasn't just hearing things. The walls were moving. Slowly, quietly, the walls were shifting, as if something was inside them, something waiting, something hungry. I ran. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled through the narrow passage, trying to make my way back to the door. But it was no use. The walls were closing in, squeezing tighter with every step. The whispers started again, louder now, more insistent. Come back. We're waiting. I had to get out. But as I reached the door, I heard it, a low, guttural sound, like a growl, followed by the scrape of claws against wood. The walls weren't the only thing moving anymore. Something was coming for me. Something far worse than I had ever imagined. And then, everything went dark. I don't know how long I was unconscious. It could have been seconds, it could have been hours. Time seemed irrelevant as I lay there in the darkness, struggling to make sense of what had happened. My head throbbed, my chest tightened, and for a moment, I wondered if I was dreaming. But when I opened my eyes, I realized this was no dream. I was still in the small, hidden room. The passage behind me was sealed tight, and the air was thick with a damp, musty odor. The floor beneath me felt cold and uneven, as though the space was shifting, warping. I could barely breathe. The whispers had stopped for the moment, but I could feel them lingering just beyond the edge of my consciousness. I pushed myself up, my hands trembling as I steadied myself against the wall. My breath was shallow, the fear creeping back with each passing second. My mind raced. What was happening? What were these things in the walls? And why was I being drawn deeper into this madness? I took a slow step forward, feeling the walls for any sign of a way out. The notes, the messages they carried, haunted me. There was something in the walls, something not human, something old and dangerous. The idea that I might be trapped here, at the mercy of whatever haunted this place, made my stomach turn. The room was darker than I remembered, the flickering light of my phone barely cutting through the shadows. But then, something changed. A low hum vibrated through the walls, a sound that seemed to pulse with life, as if the very foundation of the apartment was alive. It was a sound I couldn't ignore, a sound that seemed to call to me. I stepped forward again, closer to the center of the room, my mind clouded with confusion. The whispers had returned, softer now, like a distant lullaby, but still unmistakably present. You're here. You belong here. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The voice, it wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was clear, real. It was coming from the walls, from the very bones of the apartment. The hairs on my neck stood on end, and I turned toward the voice. But there was nothing there. I spun around, my breath quickening. The walls, the entire room, felt like it was closing in on me. The air was suffocating, heavy with dread. I backed toward the small door, the one I had entered through, only to find that it was no longer there. The walls were solid now, unyielding, as if they had never opened to me at all. Panic surged through me. I started pounding on the walls, yelling for help, but no sound came out. My throat was tight, my body numb with fear. And then it happened. A sound, a scraping, deep and slow, like claws dragging across stone. The walls began to shift, moving inwards as if something was crawling through them. The floor beneath me trembled, the very foundation of the apartment groaning as if something monstrous was stirring within it. My pulse raced as I turned to the corner of the room. There, in the shadows, something moved. It was slow, deliberate, like it was savoring my fear. A shape, dark, indistinct, loomed in the corner, and for a moment, I could only stand frozen, my body refusing to move. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, overlapping one another like 1,000 voices, all speaking at once. I couldn't make out the words, but I felt them inside me, crawling beneath my skin, filling my head with images of things too terrible to comprehend. And then, as the shape in the corner took a step forward, I saw it. A figure, tall, twisted, its face obscured by darkness. It moved in unnatural ways, its limbs stretching and bending as though they didn't obey the rules of human form. The whispers rose to a crescendo, like 1,000 voices screaming in unison. The thing in the corner smiled. I turned to run, my heart pounding, but the walls, the apartment, had changed. There was no way out. No escape. The door, the hallway, everything had disappeared into an endless void of darkness. I was trapped. The shape moved closer, its form stretching impossibly long, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The whispers were now a deafening roar in my ears, drawing out every thought, every shred of sanity. And then, the voice that had been calling to me all along, the voice from the walls, spoke again. You shouldn't have come. You'll never leave. The figure lunged, its claws outstretched, and everything went black. I awoke to the sound of something heavy, something like a door creaking open. My head spun, and my limbs felt like lead. For a moment, I thought I was still trapped in that suffocating room, in the clutches of that thing from the corner, but when I opened my eyes, the world around me seemed familiar. Too familiar. I was back in the apartment. The same apartment where I had started all this, where the renovations had begun. But everything felt different. The air was too still, the silence too profound. It was as if the entire place was holding its breath, waiting. I sat up slowly, wiping my face with trembling hands. The walls were the same, the floor was the same, everything was the same, but something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt it deep in my bones. The whispers had stopped. The oppressive sense of dread had lifted, but it had been replaced by something else. A quiet, watching presence. I got to my feet, my legs unsteady, and slowly walked through the apartment. It was eerily quiet. The kitchen, the living room, everything was as it had been before the renovations had started. But there was something wrong about it. The very air seemed stale, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. I approached the front door, hesitating for a moment. Could it really be over? Had I imagined all of it? Had I simply been dreaming, trapped in some horrible nightmare? I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway. The building was silent, still. Nothing moved. No one was there. My heartbeat quickened as I realized there was no sound at all, not the usual hum of the building's plumbing, not the creak of old wood, nothing. But as I stepped further into the hall, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The walls were covered in the same strange notes I had found earlier, the ones from the builders, the ones that spoke of warnings and fear. But these notes weren't just written by anyone. They were written by me. I didn't understand. How could they be mine? I hadn't written them. I hadn't seen them before. But there they were, scrawled across the walls in my own handwriting. Don't trust the walls. Leave before it's too late. Stop digging. You've awoken them. My hand shook as I reached out to touch the wall, the cold surface sending a chill through me. There was no way I could have written these. I hadn't been here, hadn't written anything at all. So how was this possible? A door at the far end of the hall creaked open, drawing my attention. It was a door I didn't recognize, one that hadn't been there before. The light beyond it flickered dimly, casting long shadows across the hallway. The whispers began again, this time quiet and insistent, like a chorus of voices calling me forward. I walked toward the door, my feet heavy with reluctance. Every instinct in me screamed to turn around, to leave, to run. But I couldn't. The pull was too strong. I had to know. I had to find out what was happening. As I passed the door, I saw someone standing in the shadows, just out of reach of the dim light. My heart skipped a beat. It was a figure, tall and thin, with its back turned to me. It was wearing a tattered coat, the fabric frayed and old, the sleeves dragging along the floor. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. It was as if it didn't even know I was there. I hesitated, my breath caught in my throat. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. But then, a voice, a whisper, soft and breathy, came from the shadows. Turn back. It wasn't my voice. It wasn't anyone's voice I recognized. It was the same voice from the walls, from the passages, the one that had guided me all this time. But this time, there was something different in it. Something darker, something colder. I didn't turn back. I couldn't. Instead, I took a step forward toward the figure, my eyes fixed on its still form. The closer I got, the colder the air became, the more the darkness seemed to thicken around me. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I touched the figure's shoulder. It turned. The face that met mine was not human. It was pale, too pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare into my soul. Its mouth stretched into a grotesque smile, the skin around its lips cracking and peeling like dry paper. "You're not supposed to be here," it said, its voice like a hiss, a sound I could feel deep in my chest. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. The walls around me seemed to close in, the space growing tighter with every second. The whispers were louder now, more urgent, like they were trying to warn me, trying to make me understand. But it was too late. The figure reached out with long, bony fingers, grabbing me by the wrist. Its grip was cold, colder than ice, and I felt the life drain from my body as it pulled me closer. "You're already part of it," it whispered. "You always were." Everything went dark again. When I opened my eyes again, the world was still. There was no darkness, no shadowy figure, no whispers. For a moment, I thought I had finally escaped, finally broken free from whatever nightmare had been chasing me. But the peace was deceptive. The quiet was suffocating. I was back in the apartment, but this time it felt different. The walls seemed to breathe, and the air was thick with a sense of foreboding. I could feel something pressing against me, something I couldn't see, but it was there, its presence, like a weight, pressing down on my chest. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and looked around. The apartment was unchanged. The furniture was still in place, the walls still covered in the same peeling wallpaper. But everything felt wrong. Like the world had shifted just slightly out of alignment, and I was the only one who noticed. Then I saw it. A single note, pinned to the wall by a nail. I stepped toward it, my heart pounding in my chest. As I read the words written in dark ink, my hands shook violently. "Welcome back. We've been waiting for you." The handwriting wasn't mine. It wasn't from the builders either. This was different, something older, more sinister. My breath hitched as I took a step back, my mind racing. What did it mean? Why had I come back here? It started with a question. A simple one, but one that would change everything. Have you ever found something that felt like it was waiting for you? Not just any object, but something that seemed to call out to you, to stir a memory long buried, to whisper your name even though you never uttered it aloud? I hadn't, not until that day. The small antique store tucked away in a forgotten corner of the city had always intrigued me. Its dusty windows beckoned with an air of mystery. But on that particular afternoon, something was different. I couldn't explain it, not then. But now, with the events that followed, I wonder if I was meant to be there. As I stepped through the door, the familiar scent of old wood and faded leather greeted me. The dim lighting made the place feel like a museum of forgotten things. Shelves piled high with trinkets, tarnished silverware, porcelain dolls with cracked faces, and yellowing books filled the room. The air felt heavier than usual, like the weight of history pressed down on me from all sides. I walked aimlessly through the aisles, running my fingers over the objects as I went. None of them caught my attention until I reached the back of the store. There, on a small table under a single dim bulb, sat an old locket. It was intricately designed, a swirl of vines and flowers etched in the metal, so delicate it looked as though it might crumble in your hands. The surface was scratched, worn with time, but it still shimmered faintly in the low light. Something about it pulled me closer. I didn't know why, but I reached out and picked it up. The moment my fingers brushed its surface, a chill ran through me, as if the locket had been waiting for me. It felt familiar. I hadn't seen it before, yet it was as if it had always been a part of me. My heart skipped a beat as I turned the locket over. There, engraved on the back, were two initials, M.S. I recognized them instantly. It was my grandmother's locket. The one she had worn every day until the day she passed. I had never seen another one like it. My grandmother had always said it was a family heirloom passed down from generation to generation. but it had been lost years ago, or so I had thought. I remember the tears in her eyes when she spoke of it, the way her hands trembled as she clutched it. It was one of the few things she held onto from her past. And now, here it was, in front of me, like it had somehow found its way back. I turned to the man behind the counter, an older man with a graying beard and a slightly disheveled look. He was busy arranging some items on the shelf, but he must have sensed my gaze because he looked up. "Ah, I see you found something special," he said, his voice low and raspy. "That piece has been here for a while now." I couldn't take my eyes off the locket. "How did it end up here?" I asked, though I already felt the answer was something I might not want to hear. The man hesitated for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "That's not something I can explain. Things just sometimes find their way here." His gaze flickered back to the counter, avoiding mine. "But it's a fine piece. You should take it if it's something that means something to you." I frowned, sensing an odd unease in his voice. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to have it. It was my grandmother's, after all. I handed him the money, barely hearing him mumble something about the shop being open late tonight. It wasn't until I stepped out of the store and into the cold evening air that the feeling of unease truly settled in. There was something wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the air around me felt too still. Even the sounds of the city seemed distant, muffled. I glanced down at the locket in my hand. It felt heavier now, almost as if it were pulling me in a direction I didn't understand. I quickly shoved it into my pocket, hoping to shake the strange sensation. But the feeling didn't go away. It only grew stronger. That night, the world seemed quieter than usual. No cars honking outside my window, no distant voices from the street below. Just a strange, oppressive silence that felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't until I laid the locket on my dresser that I noticed something odd. The initials M.S. weren't the only markings on it. There was something else. Small, almost invisible, but definitely there. A date, scratched faintly into the metal, April 18th, 1912. I stared at the inscription, my breath catching in my throat. April 18th, 1912. The date didn't mean anything to me, but I had a sinking feeling it was important. Very important. I turned the locket over in my hands again, my heart pounding in my chest. And that's when I heard it. A faint sound, at first just a rustle, like someone was moving behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing. Just the quiet, oppressive air. But I knew something was coming, and it had already begun. The apartment felt like a tomb now, like a place that had never been meant for the living. I looked at the walls, at the faint cracks that seemed to grow wider the longer I stared at them. The floor beneath me creaked as though something beneath it was stirring, waiting. The whispers returned, but this time they weren't just whispers. They were clear voices, speaking in unison, chanting words I couldn't quite understand. The sound filled the room, growing louder, more insistent. "Don't leave. You can never leave." I spun around, my breath quickening, my mind racing. The walls were closing in again, shifting and warping like they were alive. The door, the windows, they were gone. The apartment was becoming a prison, and I was its captive. And then I understood. The apartment was never just a building. It had been a place of sacrifice, a place where something ancient and dark had been trapped, and I had unknowingly awakened it. The builders, the notes, the warnings, they were all part of it. It was all a cycle, a pattern that had been repeating itself over and over. Those who entered, those who stayed too long, were absorbed, becoming part of the apartment, part of whatever lay hidden within its walls. I had been here before, long before the renovations began. I had written those notes, left those warnings, just as the previous tenants had. We were all part of it, all trapped in this endless loop, unable to escape. It wasn't just the apartment that was alive, it was me. And every time I thought I had escaped, it only drew me back, deeper and deeper. The walls began to hum again, the noise growing louder, reverberating through my skull. The air became thick with the stench of decay, and the darkness around me seemed to pulse with an unseen force. I felt the pull, felt the cold hands of whatever was trapped here reaching for me, pulling me back into its embrace. I knew then that there was no escaping it. I had become part of the apartment, part of the cycle. The whispers, the notes, the figure, it was all me. All of us. We were all trapped here, forever. The door behind me creaked open, but it wasn't a door I could walk through. It was the door to my undoing, the door that led back into the walls, back into the darkness. I turned, the whispers echoing in my ears, and stepped forward. And the apartment claimed me once again. The next morning, I woke to an unsettling silence. No birds chirped outside, no hum of traffic in the distance. The world felt suspended in time, as if holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the locket, it was everything. The air itself felt different, colder, heavier, as though the very atmosphere was trying to press in on me. I forced myself to go about my day, trying to distract myself from the unease that had crept into my bones. But every time I looked at the locket, that date, April 18th, 1912, echoed in my mind like a distant, ominous drumbeat. The morning passed slowly. The sounds of the world outside seemed muffled, as if I were listening to it through thick glass. I tried to focus on my work, but the locket kept calling me, its strange weight like a constant pull. I finally gave in. I took the locket and stared at it again, turning it over in my hands. The initials M.S. were still there, just as they had been in the store, but the date now seemed like an invitation, or perhaps a warning. It felt like a puzzle, one I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. As I examined it more closely, I noticed something strange. The metal of the locket wasn't smooth like it had seemed at first. Tiny, almost invisible grooves lined the surface, patterns that seemed too deliberate, too intricate to be a simple design. The more I looked, the more the locket seemed to pulse in my hand, as though it were alive, breathing, calling me towards something. I placed it on the table in front of me and stepped back, my heart hammering in my chest. The room felt colder now, the air thick with a strange, heavy presence. I thought I heard something, a low, almost imperceptible murmur, coming from the locket. At first, I thought it was my imagination. But the sound grew louder, a faint whisper, like a voice just beyond hearing. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel the urgency in it. I reached for it again, my fingers trembling. The moment I touched it, the whisper stopped, replaced by a low, creaking sound like an old door slowly opening. I jerked my hand back, my pulse quickening. There was something wrong with that locket, something beyond my understanding. I tried to dismiss the feeling, telling myself it was just nerves, just a product of too much thinking. But the unease gnawed at me, gnawing away at my sense of security. That evening, I placed the locket in a drawer and locked it away, hoping it would stop haunting me. I tried to forget about it, tried to go to bed, but sleep would not come. The silence of the night was so thick, it felt like it was swallowing me whole. Around midnight, I heard it. A faint rustling sound, like footsteps in the hallway. I froze, my heart lurching in my chest. I strained my ears, listening. Nothing. But then it came again, closer this time. The sound of someone walking, slow and deliberate. The footsteps were soft, almost inaudible, but they were unmistakable. I didn't move, barely dared to breathe. The room was too still, too quiet. I glanced at the door, waiting. But nothing happened. The footsteps stopped just outside my room, and then, in the silence, I heard it. A faint scraping sound. The sound of something being dragged across the floor. I told myself it was just my imagination, that it was just the house settling, the wind. But deep down, I knew better. The scraping grew louder, closer. It was unmistakable now. Something was being dragged, something heavy and slow, right outside my door. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. Fear had rooted me to the spot. I didn't know what was happening, didn't know if this was real or just a nightmare. Suddenly, the scraping stopped. Silence filled the room again, and for a moment, I thought it was over. But then I heard it. A faint, barely audible whisper, like a breath against my ear. The voice was cold, distant, but unmistakably clear. "It's time." I gasped, my heart leaping in my chest. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the words, but there was no time. The door creaked open, just a little, as if something was pushing it from the other side. A shadow slipped through the gap, dark and formless, stretching across the floor like a living thing. My blood ran cold as the shadow inched closer, its presence suffocating, closing in on me. The whisper came again, more urgent this time. "It's time." I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. My body felt frozen, paralyzed with fear. The shadow continued to grow, filling the room with its oppressive presence. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The door slammed shut. The room was silent once more, but the oppressive weight in the air remained. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I looked around, disoriented, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had it been real? Had I imagined it? But then I saw it, the locket, lying on the floor near the door. It had somehow gotten there, though I had locked it away. The clasp was open, and inside, a small, faded photograph had appeared, a woman I didn't recognize, her face pale and serious, staring back at me. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized the truth. The locket was no longer just a relic from the past. It was alive, and it was calling me. The morning after the night's events, I didn't know whether I was still dreaming or if I had somehow slipped into a nightmare I couldn't escape. The air felt thick, and everything seemed just a little too still. The silence was oppressive, pressing down on me like a weight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, lurking just beyond my reach. I sat in bed for hours, unable to move, my eyes glued to the spot where the locket had been the night before. It was gone. The locket, the photograph, the very presence of the shadow, all of it had vanished. As though the events of the previous night had never happened. But I knew it had. I could still feel the cold breath against my ear, the scrape of something dragging across the floor. I could still hear the whisper, "It's time." I had to get out of there. I had to get away from the house, from the locket, from whatever was happening. But no matter where I went, the feeling followed me, as if the very air itself had been contaminated. I went to the store where I had bought the locket, desperate for answers. The owner wasn't there, but the shop was, as usual, dim and cluttered. The same dusty shelves, the same ancient trinkets. But something was different now. There was a heaviness in the air, a presence that hung over everything. The man behind the counter, I hadn't noticed him the first time, watched me with sharp, penetrating eyes. His face was withered, older than I remembered, his eyes too knowing. He didn't greet me when I walked in, but I could tell he knew exactly why I was there. "I see you've come back," he said, his voice low, almost mournful. I felt a cold chill wash over me, and for a moment, I didn't know whether to ask him about the locket or demand an explanation for what had happened the night before. But something held me back. Instead, I asked the only question that seemed to matter. Why was it in the store? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. The man didn't answer immediately. He looked at me, as if weighing something in his mind. Then, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, he said, "Sometimes things come into this world in strange ways. Objects, memories, sometimes even people. They don't always belong where they end up." I felt a shiver run down my spine as his words sank in. His eyes flickered to a cabinet behind him, locked and hidden from view. Without thinking, I walked over to it. I didn't know why, but something inside me urged me to look. "Don't," the man said sharply, his voice rising in a way that startled me. "You don't want to see what's in there." But it was too late. The cabinet had already been opened. Inside, I saw an array of old, dusty objects, each one looking as though it had been untouched for years. There was a picture frame with a cracked glass, a tarnished silver spoon, and a broken pocket watch. But in the back, nestled among the forgotten treasures, was something that made my blood run cold. It was the same locket, the one I had seen the night before. Only this time, there was no photograph inside. There was nothing but a faded, scratched inscription on the inside of the lid. It was my name. I recoiled from the cabinet, my heart pounding in my chest. The man looked at me with something like pity in his eyes. "I told you," he said softly. "Some things are never meant to be found. Some things don't belong in this world." The words hung in the air like a weight, suffocating me. I turned and ran out of the store, not looking back. The wind howled outside, and the streets felt empty, silent, as though I were the last person left in the world. I didn't know where to go anymore. The locket, the man, the things I had seen, they were all part of something much larger, something I couldn't understand. But it didn't matter, because I knew, deep down, that whatever had been set in motion couldn't be undone. I didn't sleep that night. The darkness seemed to close in around me, pressing against the walls, the floor, the very air I breathed. I could hear it again, that scraping sound, distant at first, but growing closer. The shadows shifted and moved even when there was no light. I felt it watching me, waiting. And then, in the dead of night, I heard the whisper again. "It's time." This time, it was different. It was louder, closer, almost urgent. My hand shook as I reached for the drawer where I had hidden the locket. It was still there. The weight of it in my hand felt like a curse, like a tether that was pulling me towards something I wasn't ready to face. The photo inside had changed. It was no longer the woman I didn't recognize. Now, it was me. I stared at the photograph, my breath catching in my throat. The image was faded, blurry, but unmistakable. I was standing there, in that same pose, staring back at myself. The realization hit me like a blow. The locket had never belonged to my grandmother. It had never belonged to anyone in my family. It belonged to me. I had always been meant to find it. And now, I had no choice but to follow wherever it led. The air felt heavier as I stared at the locket, the photograph of myself staring back at me from its depths. I couldn't understand it. It was impossible. How could I be in the picture? How could this object, this cursed thing, know my face, my name, even before I found it? Panic gripped me, and my mind raced. Every rational part of me screamed to throw the locket away, to burn it, to destroy it somehow and end this madness. But something inside me, something dark, deep, and almost too familiar, whispered that I couldn't. It was as if the locket was holding me captive, pulling me in deeper with every breath I took. I snapped the locket shut, my hands trembling, and shoved it into the back of my drawer. But no matter how hard I tried to push the terror aside, the unease wouldn't let go. I could still feel it, that unseen force, like a weight pressing against my chest, drawing me towards something. Something I had to face, whether I wanted to or not. The whisper returned, faint at first, but growing clearer with each passing second. It's time. It was a voice that sounded almost like my own, yet not quite. A strange, distorted echo of who I was. The words sent a shiver through me, and I knew, in the deepest part of my soul, that I could not ignore them. I had no choice now. I stumbled to the window and pulled the curtains open, my eyes scanning the street below. It was dark outside, the city eerily quiet. Nothing moved, no cars, no pedestrians, just the shadows stretching in unnatural ways. I felt as if the world had stopped, or perhaps I had stopped, suspended between one reality and another. My hands clenched around the locket in my drawer, and I knew that there was no escaping whatever was coming. I had to return to the store. The moment I made that decision, I felt the air shift around me. It wasn't just the room that felt colder now, it was as if the very fabric of reality was starting to warp, twisting into something else, something darker. Every step I took toward the door felt like a journey into a place I could never come back from. The streets were deserted as I made my way to the shop. It felt as though no one else was awake, as if time itself had frozen. The only sound was the distant echo of my footsteps, growing louder with each passing moment. When I reached the shop, the door was already open. I hadn't noticed it before, but now I saw the dim light spilling out from inside. It beckoned me, pulling me forward like a moth to a flame. The closer I got, the stronger the pull became, like something alive, waiting for me. I entered without hesitation, though a part of me screamed to turn back, to flee from whatever dark force was calling me here. The shop was still the same, dusty shelves, cracked antiques, and the musty scent of forgotten things. But there was something else now. Something lurking just beyond the edges of my vision. The air was thick, suffocating, as though the space was stretching, warping. And there, standing at the counter, was the man. His face was gaunt, eyes wide and unnaturally bright, as if he had not slept in years. His voice was barely a whisper, but it seemed to resonate through the entire shop. "You've come," he said, his lips curling into a knowing smile. "I knew you would." I didn't speak. I couldn't. The locket in my pocket felt as though it were vibrating, almost alive, like it was reacting to the man's presence. The oppressive silence hung between us as I took another step forward. I didn't know I was looking for answers, maybe, or some way to escape the nightmare I had stepped into. The man's eyes never left me. "Do you know what you found?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "The locket, the photograph, it's part of something much bigger than you can understand." a line that stretches far back into time. I didn't respond. I didn't have the strength to. The locket belongs to you, yes, he continued, his voice growing more intense, but it also belongs to something else. Something ancient. And once it has claimed you, it will never let you go. His words sent a shiver down my spine. What do you mean? I finally managed to ask, but my voice sounded small, weak. What is it? The locket, he said, is a key. A key to a place that exists beyond the veil of our world. It has been passed down through generations, always finding its way to the one who is meant to claim it. And now, it has found you. My mind was racing, my thoughts a blur. A key? To what? The man stepped closer, his eyes never leaving mine. His breath was cold, his presence suffocating. Once you have opened it, there will be no turning back, he warned, his voice now almost a hiss. You will step into the world beyond, and you will not be the same. It will take everything from you. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The door behind me was suddenly so far, so unreachable. The locket, buried in my pocket, seemed to call to me with an unrelenting pull. I could feel it, urging me forward, telling me that I had to open it, that I had no choice. And then, as if on cue, the whisper returned. It's time. I looked at the man one last time, his face twisted in a strange mix of pity and something darker. Something hungry. I didn't have to say anything. He knew what I would do. The locket was already in my hand, my fingers trembling as I held it out in front of me. The engraving on the back of it glowed faintly, the initials MS now pulsating with an eerie light. I swallowed hard, the weight of the moment settling over me like a shroud. There was no turning back now. I opened the locket, and the world changed. The room around me began to twist, to warp, as though the very space itself was bending, unraveling. The walls shifted, the air became thick with a choking darkness, and for a moment I was suspended between two realities, 1 foot in this world, and 1 foot in the one that lay beyond. And then, with a sudden, deafening silence, everything stopped. The shadows swallowed the light, and the whispering was gone. I had crossed the threshold. But as I stepped into the unknown, I realized something far worse than the darkness. I wasn't alone. Something was waiting for me. Something ancient. And it was hungry. The world around me felt wrong, distorted. It was as though the very air I breathed had turned to thick, suffocating smoke, pressing in from every direction. I could no longer tell where I stood. The walls had vanished, and instead, there was a deep, endless void stretching in all directions, a place that was neither dark nor light, but something far worse, an oppressive silence. It felt as though the fabric of reality had unraveled, leaving me in a space that existed outside time, outside logic. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Every step I tried to take felt as though I were sinking deeper into the ground, as if the very floor beneath me were a trap. And yet, I could see, or perhaps feel, something in the distance, a faint flicker of light that wasn't quite light, something cold, like a reflection of a place I knew but could not reach. The locket in my hand burned with an intense heat. It was pulsing now, its glow a sickly green, and I could hear the faintest hum emanating from it, a vibration that seemed to resonate within my very bones. The whisper was gone, but its presence lingered in the silence, heavy and oppressive, like a forgotten memory clawing at the edges of my mind. It's time. The words echoed in my head again, but this time they were not whispered, they were felt. A crushing, undeniable weight. A command. I didn't have to hear them to understand what they meant. I turned in place, desperately searching for something, anything to guide me. And that's when I saw it. A figure, standing far ahead, shrouded in a cloak of shadow. It was tall, its outline blurry and indistinct, but I could feel its presence. It was watching me. There was no mistaking it. I had seen this form before, in the locket, in the photograph. It was me. My breath hitched in my chest as the realization struck me like a blow to the stomach. That was me. Or rather, it wasn't me, but it looked like me, a twisted version, an echo, something that should not exist. The figure was moving toward me, its steps slow, deliberate, as though it was savoring the moment. And then, in a voice that was both my own and yet not, the figure spoke. "Do you finally understand?" the voice asked, hollow and distant, but filled with an unbearable weight. I took a step back, my body trembling. "What are you?" I croaked, my throat dry. It didn't answer immediately. Instead, the figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering my question. The sound of its movement was unnaturally quiet, like the shifting of the very air around us. "I am what you will become," the figure said finally. "I am the echo of the choice you made." The locket opened the door, but not to a place, to a time. A time that is not yet. A time that was. And in that time, you were lost. I didn't understand. It was as if every word it spoke felt like a riddle, a message from a world that didn't belong to me. But why me? I whispered, my voice barely a sound in the crushing silence. "Because," the figure said, its voice now softer, colder, "you are the one who was meant to find it. The locket was always yours, though you didn't know it. It waits for those who will listen. And now, you are mine. You've crossed over. And in this place, you will never leave." My blood ran cold. Never leave. The words wrapped around me, squeezing tighter than any physical force could. The figure began to move closer, its steps silent but somehow heavy, each one making the air around me feel more and more suffocating. "What are you going to do?" I managed to ask, but my voice sounded small, lost in the vastness of this place. "I'm going to take you," it said simply. "Take you where you belong." Before I could react, before I could even take another breath, it reached out with a hand that was not truly a hand, but something far worse, a shadow, a shape that wasn't meant to be. The figure's fingers touched my arm, and the sensation was like fire and ice at once. My skin burned and froze in the same instant, and an unbearable pressure seemed to crush my chest. For a moment, I thought I might pass out. But I couldn't. I couldn't look away from the figure, from the horror that was now fully revealed. It was me. But it was not me. It was something twisted, something old, a ghost of what I could become. A fate I had unwittingly chosen when I opened the locket. Suddenly, I understood the true nature of the locket. It wasn't just a key to a place beyond the veil. It was a key to a version of me that should never have existed. A version of me that would be consumed by this place, this endless void, until all that remained was an echo, a hollow shell, waiting to be forgotten. I fought to pull away, but my body moved as if bound by invisible chains. The locket burned in my hand, and for a moment it seemed to resonate with the figure. The pressure against my chest grew unbearable, and I couldn't breathe. And then, just as I thought I would suffocate, I heard something. A sound, faint at first, then growing louder, like footsteps approaching from a distance. A figure, a real figure, walking toward me through the swirling nothingness. It was him. The shopkeeper. The man who had warned me. He stepped into view, his face grim, his eyes knowing. He looked at the shadowy figure and said in a low voice, "You should have never opened it." With that, the shadow recoiled, as if struck by an unseen force. It shrank away, pulling back into the darkness. But not before it left one last message, one final echo that pierced through the silence. "You are mine now. You always will be." And then, everything stopped. The air became still. The pressure lifted from my chest. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, my hands trembling. The shopkeeper knelt beside me, his face softer now, but filled with a sadness that made my heart ache. "You've seen what lies beyond," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "And now, you must make a choice. You cannot stay here forever. You will have to choose to leave or to stay." I looked at him, my head spinning. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what was real anymore, what was a nightmare and what was the truth. But one thing was clear. No matter what I chose, the world I had known was gone. And the locket? The locket was now a part of me. It all started with a letter. I know, it sounds trivial, but this wasn't just any ordinary bill. It was addressed to me, but it was for an apartment I had never rented, in a neighborhood I had never lived in. The moment I saw the return address, a chill ran down my spine. The place was listed as a flat in a building I had never even noticed before. I opened it cautiously, as if I were afraid that whatever was inside might jump out at me. The letter inside was crisp, formal, almost too perfect. "Dear Mr. Alexander Hughes, this is your final bill for the rental of apartment number 23, located at 47 West Oak Avenue. Our records show you stayed from the 1st of October to the 31st. The total amount due is $365, with a due date of the 15th of this month. Please make your payment at your earliest convenience to avoid late fees or further action. Sincerely, T. Montgomery, Property Manager." I stared at the paper for a long time, unable to process it. The address was familiar, but I had never even heard of apartment number 23. My mind raced with confusion. Who was this? Why was I being charged for something I hadn't done? I had never stayed in that building. In fact, I didn't know anyone who lived there. The street was quiet, suburban, the kind of place you pass through without a second thought. Nothing about it felt important. I had never had a reason to go there, let alone stay in one of the apartments. I thought it must have been a mistake. Maybe someone had used my name. It wasn't unusual for clerical errors to happen, right? I could easily call and sort this out. But as I picked up the phone, I hesitated. There was something about the letter that didn't sit right with me. Something about the way the property manager's name was signed. It looked too clean, too precise. I dialed the number, my fingers shaking slightly. It rang 3 times before the phone clicked, and a man's voice answered. "Hello, this is T. Montgomery, Property Manager for 47 West Oak. How may I help you?" I swallowed hard before speaking. Yes, I received a bill for apartment 23 at your property. I think there's been a mistake. I've never rented there." There was a long pause on the other end, and for a moment I thought the call had dropped. Then, in a slow, deliberate tone, Montgomery responded. "Mr. Hughes, you stayed in apartment 23 on multiple occasions. I remember seeing you there myself. Are you sure you don't remember?" The words caught me off guard. I remember seeing you there myself. What did that mean? My throat tightened as I tried to explain again, but the words felt heavier now, as though something inside me was resisting the truth. No, I've never been there. I'm sure of it. I don't even know what apartment number 23 looks like. There was another silence, one that felt thick, like something was shifting just beyond the edges of the conversation. I'm sorry, Mr. Hughes, Montgomery said finally, his voice lowering. But our records are clear. You stayed in that apartment several times. I can even confirm that your key was checked out for each of those visits. Perhaps you've forgotten. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Key? I didn't have a key. I didn't even know what the apartment looked like. I'm sorry, I said, my voice growing shaky. But there's been some mistake. I'll need you to check again. This isn't right. Montgomery's tone hardened, the calmness from earlier slipping away. Mr. Hughes, I don't make mistakes. You stayed in that apartment. I suggest you check your calendar. I'll give you one more chance to pay your bill before we take further action. I hung up before he could say more, the phone slipping from my fingers as my mind raced. What had just happened? The thought that I might have stayed there, in an apartment I didn't even recognize, didn't seem possible. But the manager's words, "I saw you there myself," echoed in my mind, replaying over and over again. I knew I hadn't been to that building, but something inside me felt unsettled. Like a memory I couldn't reach, buried deep down in the back of my mind. I tried to push the thought aside, but it kept coming back. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that something had happened. Something I couldn't explain. As the evening went on, I tried to focus on other things, but the nagging feeling refused to leave. I kept glancing at the clock, the walls of my apartment starting to feel too close, too familiar. It was like I was being watched, but every time I turned around, nothing was there. I tried to sleep, but the same sense of unease followed me into my dreams. I dreamt of a cold apartment with faded wallpaper, dim light filtering through the curtains. And in the corner, just out of sight, I saw a figure, not someone I recognized, but somehow familiar all the same. When I woke up, I felt more certain than ever that something was wrong. The apartment in my dream was the one from the bill. The one I had never lived in. I had to go there. I had to see it for myself. So, I did. And what I found there would change everything. The address on the letter, 47 West Oak Avenue, was just a few blocks away from my apartment. Not far enough to dismiss the journey, but close enough to make me feel strange about going. As I stood at the curb, staring up at the building, an unsettling sense of déjà vu washed over me. I didn't know why, but something about this place felt wrong. The building was old, brick walls covered in ivy, and windows that seemed too far apart, as if it didn't want to reveal its full face to the world. The street was quiet, but the silence felt heavy, as if everything around me was holding its breath, waiting. The air felt cold, even though the sun was out, and I had to fight the urge to turn back. But I couldn't. I had to know. I had to find answers. I walked up to the front door, feeling the weight of each step. My hand hovered over the doorbell, a feeling of dread gripping me. What if I was wrong? What if there was some kind of mistake? The idea that I had rented an apartment I didn't even remember seemed ridiculous, but the letter and the phone call had left me with no choice but to come here and face whatever this was. The door creaked open before I could press the bell. A woman stood in the doorway, a smile on her face that was just a little too wide. She was older, her hair streaked with gray, her eyes tired but kind. "Can I help you, dear?" she asked, her voice soft, almost motherly. I blinked, unsure of how to respond. I'm here about an apartment. Number 23? Her smile faltered slightly, just for a moment. "Oh, you must be Mr. Hughes," she said, as though she already knew my name. "We've been expecting you." My heart skipped a beat. "Expecting me? Is everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The woman nodded, her expression unreadable. "Yes, of course. Come in, come in. I'll show you to your apartment." Something in her tone set off a warning bell in my mind. I couldn't explain it, but I felt an overwhelming sense of unease. This wasn't right. Nothing about this felt right. But I followed her inside anyway. The hallway was dimly lit, the walls lined with faded, peeling wallpaper. The air smelled musty, as though the building hadn't seen sunlight in years. We walked down the narrow corridor, the sound of our footsteps echoing strangely in the silence. When we reached apartment 23, she turned to me, her smile now gone, replaced with something else, something too knowing, too familiar. "Here we are," she said softly, as if she had been waiting for this moment for a long time. I stared at the door, suddenly hesitant. Something about the number 23 seemed to stand out, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The door was old, chipped, and scratched as though it had been opened and closed 1,000 times. But the lock was new, shiny even, and the brass handle gleamed in the dim light. I reached out and touched it, feeling a sudden surge of heat run through my fingers. My skin prickled as if the door itself was alive. Before I could turn the handle, the woman spoke again. "Go on. Open it. I'm sure you'll remember soon enough." The words hit me like a physical blow, the weight of them settling heavily in my chest. There was no turning back now. I pushed open the door. Inside, the apartment was everything I didn't expect. It was small, cramped, with a single window that let in a faint, gray light. The furniture was old, covered with dust, but the layout was familiar. The couch, the coffee table, the warm rug, it all felt as if it had been pulled directly from some distant memory I couldn't quite recall. My stomach churned. "Do you recognize it now?" the woman asked from behind me. Her voice had grown quieter, almost as if she were speaking to herself. I turned to face her, but she was gone. There was no one standing in the doorway. I was alone. I stepped further into the room, drawn to the strange feeling that had settled in my chest. Every detail of the apartment felt too real, too much like a memory, yet it was all wrong, twisted. I looked around, trying to make sense of it. But the more I looked, the more familiar it became, and the more alien it felt. The kitchen, tucked behind a narrow archway, was small, but it had everything I needed: stove, fridge, sink. A wooden table sat against the wall, a place for meals that had never been eaten. The shelves were empty, save for one dusty photo frame. I walked over to the frame and picked it up, a chill creeping up my spine. Inside was a photo of a younger version of myself, a man I didn't recognize. He was standing by a door, one I now realized was this very apartment door, smiling at the camera. His eyes were the same as mine, but the smile, it was different. It was knowing. He knew something I didn't. I set the photo down slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. What the hell is going on? I turned and glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 5 in the afternoon. But the light outside had taken on a strange, dim hue, like twilight was closing in early. Suddenly, I heard it. The soft click of the door closing behind me. I whipped around, but there was no one there. I had left the door open. I was sure of it. I tried the handle. It wouldn't budge. I pulled harder. Still nothing. Panic started to creep in. Something was wrong. This apartment, it wasn't just an apartment. It was a place I was supposed to remember, a place I had been before, but didn't. And now, I couldn't leave. I banged on the door, my heart racing, but the silence that followed was suffocating. It was as if the world outside had forgotten I was here. Then, as I stood there, frozen with fear, the whispering began again. "You should have remembered, Mr. Hughes." I spun around, but no one was there. And then I realized I wasn't alone. I had never been alone here. The air in the apartment thickened, pressing down on me with a weight that made it hard to breathe. The faint whispering grew louder, surrounding me, but the words were impossible to understand, slipping through my mind like water through my fingers. Every time I tried to focus, they faded, only to return with a slightly different tone, more urgent, more insistent. "You should have remembered, Mr. Hughes." The voice was no longer a whisper, it was a murmur, coming from all directions, as though the very walls of the apartment were alive and speaking in unison. I felt my heartbeat quicken, my palms clammy as I pressed them against the door, desperate to escape. But it wouldn't budge. The handle remained cold, unyielding. The apartment felt more like a trap with every passing second, and I realized with a jolt that the walls themselves seemed to be closing in on me. I turned back into the room, desperate for some kind of explanation, something to make sense of the nightmare I had found myself in. The couch, the table, the shelves, everything was the same, yet everything was different. The longer I stared at the familiar, the more unfamiliar it became. A faint creaking sound pulled me from my thoughts. It came from the far corner of the room, a place I hadn't noticed before. I squinted into the dimness, my pulse racing as I took a step toward it. There, in the corner, was a small wooden chest, its edges worn, the wood scuffed and scratched. It hadn't been there when I first entered. I moved cautiously toward it, my hands trembling as I crouched down to get a better look. The chest was locked, but the key was lying on top, as if it had been waiting for me. The key was strange, heavy in my palm, shaped with intricate designs I didn't recognize. I felt a strange compulsion to use it. I inserted the key into the lock with trembling hands, the metal scraping against the wood as the lock clicked open. Slowly, I lifted the lid, my breath catching in my throat. Inside, the chest was lined with faded velvet, its surface soft and worn. But it wasn't the lining that caught my attention, it was the object resting in the center. A book. Its cover was old, leather-bound, with strange symbols embossed on the front. I reached for it instinctively, my fingers brushing against the worn surface, and a jolt of recognition shot through me. I knew this book. The moment my fingers touched it, the room seemed to tilt, the walls warping in a way that made me feel disoriented. My heart pounded in my chest, and I pulled the book from the chest with a sense of urgency. The moment it left its resting place, the whispering stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. I opened the book, my eyes scanning the yellowed pages. The writing was strange, in a language I didn't understand, but there was one thing that stood out. On the very first page, in neat handwriting, was a single sentence. "The past will come for you, and you will never be free of it." My blood ran cold. Suddenly, I felt something behind me, a presence, a pressure in the air. I turned quickly, my heart racing, but the apartment was empty. There was no one there. Still, I felt like I was being watched. My skin prickled, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. You should have remembered. The voice was clearer now, not coming from the walls, but from somewhere deeper within the apartment. It was coming from the book. I dropped it, the pages flipping wildly as though caught in some invisible wind. The book fell to the ground, and the whispering grew louder, almost deafening, as if the apartment itself was alive, breathing in rhythm with my panicked heartbeats. I scrambled to my feet, my hands shaking as I backed away from the book. I had to get out. I couldn't stay here any longer. But as I reached for the door again, something stopped me. I looked at the clock. It was still 5 o'clock. But now, the hands of the clock were moving backward, slowly, agonizingly slow. Time itself seemed to be slipping away, as if the world around me was unraveling. And then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing through the apartment. I froze, my blood running cold. They were coming closer. The sound of boots on wooden floors, each step drawing nearer, too precise, too methodical to be a figment of my imagination. I turned, my eyes scanning the room frantically, searching for the source of the sound. There, just beyond the hallway, I saw a shadow move, a figure, tall and looming, its form shifting, indistinct. It was walking toward me, and with each step, the temperature in the room dropped, the air growing heavy with an unnatural cold. I could barely breathe, panic clawing at my throat as the figure came closer. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. Its movements were too fluid, too unnatural. It was as if it were a part of the apartment itself, something that had always been there but had remained hidden until now. The shadow stopped just beyond the threshold of the room, its presence filling the space like a cloud. I could feel it, like an oppressive weight pressing down on me, suffocating me. "You've come for what's yours," the voice whispered, now clear and distinct. It wasn't the same whisper from before. This time, it was cold, commanding. "And now, you'll never leave." I took a step back, my mind racing. My breath came in ragged gasps, my vision swimming. The figure remained still, its presence growing stronger, more defined. It was no longer just a shadow. Now, it was a shape, a tall, gaunt figure with a face that was vaguely familiar. The features were blurred, but I could see the outline of eyes, dark and hollow, staring at me with an intensity that froze my blood. I turned toward the door again, my hand reaching out in desperation, but before I could move, the figure spoke once more. "It's too late, Mr. Hughes. You've already signed the bill. You're already ours." The room began to spin. The figure advanced toward me, its steps slow, deliberate. I tried to move, to flee, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air thick and suffocating. The figure reached out, its long, skeletal hand brushing against my arm, sending a wave of cold through my body. The touch burned, ice cold, but not in a way that was physical. It was deeper, as if the chill were seeping into my very soul. And in that moment, I understood. I had been here before. This place, this apartment, this presence. It wasn't just a building. It was my prison. And there was no escape. The figure's hand lingered on my arm, its touch like an icy flame, searing through my flesh and sinking deep into my bones. I tried to scream, but no sound came from my mouth. The air around me felt suffocating, thick with an unseen force that pushed me down, pinning me in place. Every instinct in my body screamed to run, to escape, but my legs wouldn't obey. I tried to pull away, but the figure's grip tightened, and I felt my heart skip a beat. I was being pulled closer to it, dragged towards something far worse than I could comprehend. You don't remember, do you? The voice was low, almost gentle, as it whispered in my ear. You were never meant to forget. The words reverberated through my mind like a dark echo, twisting everything I thought I knew. I had never been here. I didn't even know who this thing was, yet somehow it knew me. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew this place. The apartment. The building. The feeling of the walls closing in around me. It was all too familiar, but I had buried it deep within me, locked away so tightly that I had forgotten it ever existed. But this was the price of forgetting. The figure stepped forward, its dark eyes boring into mine as if searching for something in deep within me. It was waiting for me to understand, waiting for me to remember the truth. Why was I here? I wondered, struggling to breathe as the figure's grip on my arm grew colder, tighter. What had I done to deserve this? The figure seemed to sense my confusion, its form shifting slightly, its outline blurring like smoke in the air. Then, as if mocking my bewilderment, it spoke again. You made a choice, Mr. Hughes. You chose to forget. But you can't escape what's already been paid for. I tried to pull away again, my body screaming for release, but it was futile. The presence of the figure grew stronger, the air around me growing heavier, thicker, as if the walls were closing in to trap me inside. The temperature continued to drop, the chill in the room now biting into my skin, turning my breath into mist. What had I done? It was as though a veil had been lifted, and memories that I hadn't even realized were mine began to flood my mind, like a distant dream that I could almost reach but could never fully grasp. The apartment. The building. The time. It was all starting to make sense now, but in the worst possible way. I could see it, feel it. The reason why this place felt so wrong. Why everything about it seemed both familiar and foreign. This apartment, this building, had been a part of me for much longer than I had ever realized. The apartment was never meant to be a home. It was meant to be a prison. A trap. A place where memories were erased, where the truth was buried so deep that it was impossible to remember what had really happened. And I was part of it. Part of the cycle. You should have remembered. The figure's voice was almost mournful now, as if it were pitying me. But you chose to forget, just like the others before you. Others before me? A cold, unsettling realization swept through me. I wasn't the first to fall into this trap. There had been others, countless others who had made the same mistake. Forgotten, fled, and paid the price for it. The apartment wasn't just a building. It was a place of reckoning. A place where people came to confront the things they had buried deep within themselves. But they never left. No one ever left. And I would never leave either. No one remembers, the figure whispered, its voice growing fainter, as if it were fading into the very fabric of the apartment itself. Except those of us who never forget. I fought to shake free of the figure's grasp, my entire body trembling with fear. I couldn't let this happen. I couldn't let myself become one of them. But even as I struggled, even as I pulled against the icy grip, the truth sank in deeper, and the realization became undeniable. I wasn't meant to leave. This apartment, this place had been my fate all along. I had only been playing the part of a person who could escape. But there was no escape. There never had been. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath came out in heavy, ragged gasps as the air grew impossibly cold. I could feel the presence of the figure behind me, but I didn't dare turn to face it again. The shadow's voice, now a whisper, slid under my skin, threading itself through my thoughts like a dark memory that I could never shake. "You're here because you were meant to be," it murmured. "We all are." And then, before I could respond, before I could even take another breath, the room began to shift. The walls seemed to bend and warp, the apartment blurring around me. The apartment I had entered was no longer the same. It was distorted, twisted, a mirror of something else, something far darker. The once familiar furniture was now broken, decaying, as if it had been abandoned for years. The air was thick with dust, the dim light filtering through the cracks in the walls casting strange shadows that danced like living things. I was no longer standing in the same place. I was somewhere else. Somewhere I couldn't quite place, but I knew it. Somewhere deep inside, I knew this was the place I had been running from all along. And there, standing in the corner of the room, was the chest. The same chest. The same key. The same book. But this time, the book was open. And the words that had once been written inside it were now fading, disappearing from the pages as if they had never existed in the first place. I stepped closer, my hand reaching out, trembling. And then I saw it. The words, written in a language I finally understood. "The bill has been paid." My mind reeled. The weight of it hit me like a tidal wave. It was too late. It had always been too late. The door to the apartment creaked open behind me. And I knew then that there was no escape from the cycle. There never had been. The bill was paid, and I was the one who had signed it. The only question left was whether I would remember it all, or if I would forget again. And the price of that would be even higher. The door swung open with a slow, agonizing creak, as though it were reluctant to reveal what lay beyond. The space on the other side was shrouded in shadow, but I could feel it, like a presence watching me, waiting for me to step forward. I had no choice now. It was inevitable. I took a step, then another, my feet moving as if they were no longer mine. The weight of what I had just understood hung over me, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. The apartment, the building, this place, they had all been part of something larger, something far more insidious than I could have ever imagined. And now, as I crossed the threshold, I was bound to it. The moment my foot crossed the doorway, I felt the temperature drop once more. My breath turned to mist, swirling in front of my face. The shadows deepened, and I could no longer see clearly. The hallway stretched out before me, endless, like a dark tunnel that went on forever. The walls were cracked, old, and decayed, and the air smelled stale, like something had died here long ago. I tried to turn around. The door was gone. I was trapped again. I reached out, my fingers grazing the cold walls, hoping for something, anything, to give me an answer. But the hallway was silent. The whispers had stopped, and for a moment, I almost felt relief. But then, from the corners of my mind, I heard it again. "You've come back." The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a dull hum, vibrating through the very air around me. I looked around frantically, but there was no one there. Only shadows, swirling in the corners of my vision. "You've come back to us." I felt a wave of nausea hit me as I realized the truth. it wasn't just the apartment that was alive. It was everything. The building itself, the walls, the air. They were all part of this unending cycle, a cycle that had claimed so many before me, and now it had claimed me too. The figure, the shadow, the voice that haunted me. They were part of it. All of it. They were the guardians of this place, and I was nothing more than a pawn in their twisted game. The hallway began to stretch even further, the walls growing darker, more oppressive. My steps felt heavier, as if the ground itself was pulling me deeper into its grip. The whispering started again, louder this time, growing more frantic. The voices of those who had come before me. I could hear their cries, their pleas for help. But there was no answer. There never had been. I turned again, desperate to find a way out. My mind screamed for escape, but my body refused to obey. I had signed the bill. I had made the choice, even if I hadn't known it at the time. I had chosen to forget, and now I was paying the price. No one ever leaves, the voice said, and I realized that it was not just a warning, it was a promise. I staggered forward, my legs weak, my mind spinning. The hallway stretched out before me, an endless loop. The walls seemed to close in on me, crushing me, suffocating me. Every step I took only brought me deeper into the heart of the building, deeper into the cycle. I saw a door at the end of the hallway, its surface cracked and faded. I didn't know what was behind it, but I knew that it didn't matter. There was no escape. I reached the door, my hand trembling as I placed it on the cold, splintered wood. The door creaked open, revealing the same room I had started in, the same apartment, the same broken furniture, the same chest. But now, something was different. The chest was open, and the book was lying there, its pages blank. I reached for it instinctively, the weight of the book familiar in my hands. But as I opened it, I saw that the first page had changed. The words that had once been written there had faded completely, leaving only one sentence. The bill is paid. I slammed the book shut, panic rising in my chest. I backed away, my breath coming in short gasps. The room was spinning again, the walls warping around me as if they were alive. Then I heard it. A familiar sound. A voice. "You've come back, Mr. Hughes." The figure stood in the doorway, its dark eyes fixed on me. It was no longer a shadow, but something far worse. Its features were sharp, angular, like a grotesque reflection of a person, but twisted, unnatural. "You never left." And that's when I understood. I had never escaped. There was no escape. The apartment wasn't a place. It was a loop, a never-ending cycle of the same events repeating over and over again. Every time I thought I had found a way out, it pulled me back. It always pulled me back. The figure stepped forward, its cold, hollow eyes staring into mine. It smiled, but it wasn't a smile of joy. It was a smile of knowing, of understanding. And then it spoke, the words piercing my soul. "You are ours now." The room darkened, and the figure reached out to touch my arm again. The coldness of its touch spread through my body, through my mind, until I was frozen. Frozen in this moment. Frozen in time. I had become part of the cycle. And it would never end. As the darkness consumed me, I heard one last whisper, a voice fading into nothing. "You will never leave." And then, silence. The loop had begun again. Have you ever gotten a bill for something you're absolutely sure you never did? A service you never asked for, a product you never received. It doesn't make sense, right? But that's exactly what happened to me. I don't know what to make of it. Was it a mistake? A scam? Or something more sinister? It all began when I came home one evening after work to find a letter waiting for me on the doorstep. It wasn't an ordinary letter. It was an envelope, thick, with an official-looking stamp. I didn't recognize the address or the sender, which made me a little uneasy. You know that feeling when you're not sure if you're supposed to open something or just throw it away? But curiosity got the better of me, and I tore it open. Inside, there was a bill. It was addressed to me, my name, my address, everything checked out. But the content? It didn't. It was a bill for rent. Rent for an apartment I had never rented. The details listed a monthly fee, the date of move-in, and a startlingly familiar apartment number, number 12. A place I had never seen before in my life. The bill even included the dates of the supposed stay, marking off a span of several months. I stared at the bill in disbelief. Maybe it was a mix-up, I thought. A mistake. It had to be. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt something cold settle on my stomach. There was a name at the bottom of the bill, the landlord, or the owner, I guessed. It read, Vincent Hall. Again, the name meant nothing to me. I had never heard of him, nor had I ever rented anything from him. But as I looked down at the piece of paper in my hands, the address on the letter matched my own. I couldn't let it go. I decided to visit the address on the bill, thinking that maybe there was some sort of administrative error. A mix-up with the system, or perhaps a case of identity theft. I needed answers. The walk to the building wasn't far. It was a short distance from my apartment, just a couple of blocks. But as I approached the building where apartment number 12 was located, something felt off. The building seemed familiar, though I couldn't place where I had seen it before. It had a strange presence about it, old, worn down, like it had been here far longer than it should have. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, unsure of what to do next. But my thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a door opening. A man walked out from the building, a middle-aged man with a thin mustache and a heavy coat. He was looking down at something in his hands when he stopped in front of me, his eyes narrowing slightly as he noticed me standing there. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. "I got this bill," I said, pulling the piece of paper from my jacket pocket. "It says I've been renting an apartment here, but I've never been inside." The man looked at the bill for a moment, his eyes scanning the paper with an unreadable expression. He didn't say anything right away, but I could see his brow furrow in confusion. "You've never been here?" he asked, a touch of surprise in his voice. "Are you sure?" "Yes," I replied, forcing myself to stay calm. "I've never rented from you or anyone here." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked me over carefully, as though trying to place me. Then, after a long pause, he stepped closer and gestured for me to follow him inside. "You better come in," he said. "We need to talk." I was taken aback. I had expected him to deny the error or brush it off. Instead, he seemed almost urgent. Reluctantly, I followed him into the building. The lobby was small, dimly lit, with faded wallpaper peeling at the edges. It had the feel of a place that hadn't been updated in decades, a place stuck in time. The man led me past a few closed doors, and I noticed that the hallway seemed unnervingly quiet. Not a sound except the echo of our footsteps on the old wooden floor. Finally, he stopped at a door. Number 12. He turned to face me and said, "I've seen you here before, you know." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked, though the question seemed stupid even as I said it. "You've been here more than once," he said. "I've seen you. You're not mistaken. You stay here." I was confused. "No," I insisted. "I haven't. I'm telling you, I've never been in this building." The man's expression grew darker, more intense. "I know what I saw," he said. "You've been here. More than once." His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I felt a strange sense of vertigo, as if the floor beneath me was shifting. The walls of the building seemed to close in, and the air felt heavy with something I couldn't quite explain. I wanted to turn and leave, but something held me there. Something in his voice. Something in the way the building seemed to hum with a strange energy that I couldn't understand. "This place has a way of keeping its memories," the man said, his voice lowering, almost a whisper now. "You're not the first to have forgotten." I didn't understand. I didn't know what he was talking about, but I felt it now, a deep, creeping sense of unease, like something was shifting around me, like the very fabric of reality was starting to twist. "Let's go inside," the man said, his hand resting on the door handle. "You've been here before. You need to remember." I didn't know if I could trust him. But what choice did I have? I stepped forward, and as the door creaked open, a cold draft rushed past me. The room beyond was dark, the air thick with dust, and the walls felt too close, too oppressive. I had never been here, but something told me I had. And as the door closed behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't going to like what I found. The door shut behind me with a low, resounding thud that sent a shiver through my body. For a moment, the silence seemed unbearable. The air in the room was stale, thick with the scent of old wood and something else, something faintly metallic that I couldn't quite place. The man, Vincent Hall, stepped aside, his eyes never leaving me. He motioned for me to look around. "Go ahead," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Take a look. You'll remember." I hesitated. There was no way this could be real. I had never been inside this place. But as I glanced around the room, a strange sense of familiarity washed over me. The walls were bare, save for a small painting in the corner and a simple, worn-out couch that sat against the wall. A lamp on a nearby table flickered intermittently, casting erratic shadows on the peeling wallpaper. I stepped forward, my footsteps echoing in the silence. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. The furniture looked like it had been chosen for its simplicity, or maybe its purpose was to be overlooked, to feel like nothing at all. But as I moved further into the room, the faintest feeling of dread grew within me. Something wasn't right. I turned to Vincent, searching his face for any sign that this was some kind of prank or misunderstanding. But his expression was dead serious. His eyes were dark, almost sunken, and there was a distant, weary look in them, as if he had seen too much of this building's secrets to care anymore. "You see," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "it's not just about renting the apartment. It's about what stays with you. What follows you." I felt a chill spread across my back. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing tighter, and for a moment, I thought I could hear the faintest whispers. At first, it sounded like static, like the crackling of an old radio left on. But then it morphed into something clearer, voices, low and unintelligible, murmuring in a language I didn't recognize. I spun around, searching for the source of the sound, but the room remained still. My breath quickened, and my pulse raced. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, warping and twisting as if alive, creeping toward me. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Vincent nodded slowly, a grim look on his face. "They're always there. Always watching, always listening." I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. "Who is? What's going on here?" His eyes darkened. "People like you come here and forget. Forget who they are, forget why they're here. But the building doesn't forget. It never forgets." The walls felt like they were closing in. I could hear the hum of the shadows now, louder and clearer, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I wasn't alone. The whispers began to take form, their words sharp and cutting through the fog of my confusion. "You're one of them." I turned quickly to Vincent, my eyes wide with fear. "What are they saying? What is that?" "They know," he said, his voice hollow. "They know what's happened. They know it's always happening here. And so do you." I recoiled from his words, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. This wasn't just about an apartment or a simple billing mistake. It was something deeper, something much darker than I had imagined. "You think you're here by chance," Vincent continued, his voice growing quieter. "But this place has a way of finding people. It calls to them, lures them in. And once you're here, there's no leaving. No matter how hard you try to run." My breath caught in my throat. "What do you mean? You're saying I've been here before?" Vincent didn't answer right away. He turned toward the window, his back to me, his shoulders tense. "When people leave," he said, his voice tight, "they forget. They forget everything. Their stay, their reason, everything. But the building doesn't forget. It remembers. It always remembers." I stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do or say. The room felt like it was shifting, bending, warping. The air grew heavier, suffocating. And then, with a sudden clarity, something deep within my mind clicked. I had been here before. I knew I had. The room, it wasn't just the same apartment number. It was the same apartment. The same furniture. The same walls. Everything. I had stayed here. I had lived here. But why couldn't I remember? My head spun, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I had never rented this place. I had never agreed to stay here. But somehow, it was all so familiar. The furniture, the creaking floors, even the smell of the air. Why don't I remember? I whispered, my voice barely audible. Vincent turned slowly, his face grim. "Because the building makes you forget," he said simply. "It erases everything. Every detail, every memory, every reason why you're here. You're never meant to remember." I stumbled back toward the door, my mind racing. This isn't real. This can't be real. Vincent's eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, I saw a flash of something terrifying in his gaze. "You're one of the lucky ones," he said, his voice a low, almost soothing tone. "Some people never leave. They stay. They never realize they're trapped." His words hung in the air like a weight, suffocating me. I reached for the door handle, my hands shaking. I needed to leave. I needed to get out. But as I opened the door, something caught my eye. It was a small, framed photo on the wall next to the exit, an old, yellowed photograph of a man standing in front of the building. The man was familiar. His face, it was mine. I felt my knees go weak and I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. "No," I whispered, shaking my head in disbelief. This isn't possible." But there it was. My face, frozen in time, staring back at me from the photograph. And as I turned to leave, I realized with a horrible certainty that I had never truly left. The building had claimed me, and it would never let me go. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my eyes fixed on the photograph that had shattered my sense of reality. The man in the photo, me, was wearing the same confused expression I must have had at that very moment. How was this possible? How had I not remembered posing for that picture? How had I never seen it before? My breath became shallow, and I could feel the walls closing in around me, the air thick and suffocating. The room felt like it was spinning, the light flickering above me, casting erratic shadows across the peeling wallpaper. I turned back to Vincent, my mind reeling. This isn't real. I've never been here before. I swear it. You're lying. Vincent stood by the window, staring out at the gray sky, his face expressionless. He didn't turn to look at me. "It's not about what you remember," he said quietly. "It's about what the building remembers." "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow breath, as if gathering his thoughts. Finally, he spoke. "The building doesn't just house people," he began, his voice low. "It keeps them. It traps them in the memories they don't want to remember. It erases the truth, makes you forget, so you keep coming back. You think you're leaving, but you're never really gone." I took a step toward him, shaking my head in disbelief. "But how? How can a building do that?" Vincent turned to face me, his eyes dark and heavy with something that almost resembled pity. "You think it's just the walls, the rooms, the doors?" He chuckled bitterly. "No. It's not that simple. The building feeds off of the people who pass through it. It doesn't just house them. It absorbs them." I felt a chill run through my body. "Absorbs them?" I whispered, my heart pounding. "What do you mean?" Vincent's gaze flickered for a moment, as if he was choosing whether or not to tell me the full truth. Finally, he spoke, his voice almost a whisper. "Everyone who stays here becomes part of the building. You become part of its history, its memory. Every person who rents an apartment, every person who stays for even a single night, is absorbed into the walls. It's like they reappear." My breath caught in my throat. "Reappear? Don't you get it?" Vincent said, his voice growing more urgent. "The building doesn't let you leave. You think you're walking out, going back to your normal life, but you're not. It pulls you in, makes you a part of it, over and over. You forget, and then you return, like a broken record." My mind raced, trying to process the magnitude of what he was saying. My stomach churned, and the room seemed to shift again, as if the floor was giving way beneath me. But why?" I stammered, struggling to keep my composure. "Why do I have no memory of this? Why can't I remember any of it?" Vincent looked at me with an almost sad expression. The building erases it. It erases your memories, makes you forget the truth so you'll come back. It's a trap, a cycle that never ends. But you've always known it, even when you didn't. I wanted to scream, to argue, to deny everything he was saying, but something inside me twisted with recognition. His words felt too familiar, too close to the truth I was terrified to face. I thought back to the letter, the bill, the apartment number 12, and the feeling that had washed over me when I first saw the building. I thought about the photo of me, and it was as if a veil had been lifted, showing me the horrifying truth. I had been here before. More than once. I staggered backward, pressing my hand against the wall for support. No, I gasped. This can't be real. I've never stayed here. I haven't. Vincent's face softened, and he took a step closer. You haven't remembered, but the building remembers you. And it always will. It always calls you back. The words sank into me like a cold weight. I wanted to argue. I wanted to deny it all, but I couldn't. Deep inside, I knew he was right. Suddenly, the room seemed to distort around me. The walls seemed to pulse with an eerie, rhythmic thrum, as if the building itself was alive, breathing in time with my own heartbeat. The whispering voices, once faint, grew louder again, more insistent, more demanding. I could hear them clearly now. You've come back. You'll stay. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the sound, but it was impossible. The voices were everywhere. They were inside my head, clawing at my thoughts, forcing me to remember what I had tried to forget. Vincent's voice cut through the noise, his words like ice. You've been here before, and you'll come back again. The building won't let you go. It won't let anyone go. I opened my eyes to find that the room had changed. The furniture was different now. The walls had shifted. It was no longer the same apartment I had entered. It was the same, but it wasn't. The door to the hallway was gone. The only way out was deeper into the apartment. Into the rooms I had never seen, but somehow knew. I took a hesitant step forward, but my legs felt heavy, like I was walking in a dream, or worse, a nightmare. The walls seemed to close in again, and the air grew thick with the sense that something was watching me, waiting. Vincent's words echoed in my mind, and I realized, with a sinking feeling, that I couldn't leave. I couldn't even try to leave. The building had already made its choice, and I was already trapped. The weight of the building's gaze pressed down on me, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I could hear the walls themselves whispering. It wasn't just the echoes of voices from the past, it felt like something more. A pulse, a heartbeat, a rhythm that bound everything together. The building was alive. It wasn't just bricks and mortar, it was something far darker, more insidious. My chest tightened. The air felt colder now, like it had drawn in the very chill of the dead. I could barely move, my legs frozen to the spot. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to lengthen, stretched toward me like fingers reaching out from the past. I turned slowly, not wanting to acknowledge the truth that had begun to form in my mind, but the building, the room, they weren't going to let me pretend anymore. I had been here before. I had lived here before. Vincent watched me with those hollow eyes, as though waiting for me to process the truth. This isn't possible, I whispered again, but this time I didn't believe it. I couldn't deny it anymore. I was here. I was in this apartment. Vincent nodded, his face grim. You stay here. You've forgotten, but that's how it works. You don't remember the way out. And you never will. I shook my head, desperate for clarity. But why? Why does it do this? Why can't I remember anything? He took a step toward me, his voice quiet. Because it doesn't want you to remember. It wants you to keep coming back. And you will, over and over. The memories fade, but the building remembers, and so do you, on some level. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. The building wasn't just some inanimate structure. It was a trap, a force that fed on the lives of those it consumed, slowly erasing their existence until they no longer recognized themselves. And the worst part? I was a part of it, whether I remembered it or not. I turned back to the photograph on the wall. There was no mistaking it now. That man in the picture was me. But how had I ended up there? Why had I never seen this image before? I was trapped in a loop, a cycle of forgotten lives, and I didn't know how to escape. What happens to people who don't remember? I asked, my voice trembling. Vincent's lips tightened, and his eyes darkened with something that almost seemed like pity. They stay. They become part of the building. They're absorbed into the walls, into the very fabric of it. They become like echoes, unable to escape, reliving the same moment over and over. I recoiled. The idea of being trapped in a never-ending cycle, losing myself to a place that never let go, was too much to bear. No, I won't be like them. I won't. But Vincent didn't respond. Instead, he turned back to the window, staring out at the bleak city beyond. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. And in that silence, I could feel the walls closing in on me again. The air grew even colder, and the faint hum of the building grew louder, more insistent, like it was alive, like it was pulling me in. Then, in a flash of memory, something else surfaced. A door. A room. I had seen this before. It was like a vision, a sudden rush of images, too fast to catch, but too vivid to ignore. I saw myself walking through a hallway, an identical hallway, one just like the one I was standing in now. And at the end of the hallway was a door. A door I knew I had opened before. I rushed toward the door, my heart racing in my chest. I had to get out. I had to. The door seemed so familiar, like it had been waiting for me. The handle was cold to the touch, but when I turned it, the door swung open without resistance. Beyond it was a room. It looked like an apartment, but it wasn't the same one I had just been in. The furniture was different, the walls a different shade of beige, the windows covered with heavy curtains. But the feeling was the same. It felt like home, and that terrified me. I stepped inside, and as soon as I did, I knew. I had been here before. I had stayed here. And something deep in my mind had been trying to push it away, to bury it in the depths of forgotten memories. But now, standing in this room, it all came rushing back. I saw myself sitting on the couch, reading a book, the sunlight filtering in through the window. I saw myself standing at the window, watching the world go by. I saw myself pacing, restless, as if I knew something wasn't right. As if I could feel the building's presence, even when I didn't understand it. And I saw myself, just as I was now, opening the door to leave, but never truly leaving. Never able to escape. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. The lights flickered, casting the room into brief flashes of darkness. The whispering voices grew louder, their words blending into a chant. You can't leave. You can't escape. I turned around, my heart racing, only to find the room beginning to distort, the walls stretching and warping like they were made of liquid. The ceiling lowered, and the floor seemed to shift beneath my feet. The apartment was no longer an apartment. It was part of the building, part of its memory. I tried to run, but the door was gone. The hallway I had walked through had disappeared, replaced by an endless, twisting void. And in that void, I could hear the voices again, louder, more urgent. You'll never leave. I fell to my knees, the realization settling like a weight on my chest. This wasn't just an apartment. It wasn't just a mistake. It was my life. And I was never going to leave. Vincent's voice echoed in my mind, his words a haunting reminder of what I was now part of. Once you're here, you never truly leave. You just fade into the walls. The building had claimed me, and I was just another ghost in its endless loop. The walls seemed to breathe with a life of their own, the air thick and oppressive. My pulse throbbed in my ears, and every breath I took felt heavy, as if the air itself was pressing down on me, suffocating me. The voices had grown to a deafening roar, a chorus of whispers that wrapped around my thoughts, pulling me deeper into the abyss. I struggled to move, my legs weak, my body trembling as I fought the overwhelming sense of dread that threatened to consume me. The building wasn't just a structure anymore. It was a living thing, and I was part of it. I was trapped in a memory that wasn't mine, in a place that had swallowed me whole, and now it was erasing me. The room shifted again, the walls stretching and contracting like a grotesque heart. The furniture blurred, becoming formless shadows that flickered in and out of focus. The light, dim and flickering, distorted the shapes around me, and I could see myself reflected in the warped mirror of the walls. I was no longer the person I had once been. I was part of the building, my identity dissolving into the very air I breathed, my body fading into the walls, becoming one with the cycle. The memories that had once defined me were slipping away, replaced by fragments of images, half-formed thoughts. I wasn't sure what was real anymore. Was I the person who had walked into this apartment? Or was I the person who had always been here, trapped in the loop of forgotten lives? I stumbled forward, desperate for something, anything that could break the grip of this place. The hallway that had once felt so familiar was now an endless stretch of darkness, stretching far beyond the limits of the building. There were no doors, no windows, just walls that seemed to close in with every step. Help me! I screamed, but the words fell flat in the still air, swallowed by the thick, suffocating silence that surrounded me. Then, as if in answer, a faint sound echoed from somewhere far down the hall. A soft click, followed by the creak of a door opening. I froze. Could it be? Could there really be an exit? I turned and ran toward the sound, my feet unsteady, my heart pounding in my chest. With every step, the air grew colder, the voices growing louder, their words twisting into something darker, more malevolent. You're not leaving. You belong here. The door loomed ahead, bathed in a faint, ghostly light. I reached for the handle, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold metal. The moment I touched it, the building seemed to shudder, and the floor beneath me trembled. I pulled the door open, and the hallway beyond was unlike anything I had seen before. It was not the same hallway I had walked through earlier. This one was narrow, claustrophobic, and lined with doors, each one identical, each one leading into an apartment that I knew, deep down, had never been mine. I backed away from the door, my breath quick and shallow. This wasn't an escape. It was just another part of the cycle. Another trap. I felt something shift behind me, and when I turned, I saw Vincent standing in the doorway, his face pale and expressionless. He didn't need to say anything. I already knew. "You can't leave," he said quietly, almost as though he were stating a fact, not a warning. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but it was useless. I had already fought, and I had already lost. The building had claimed me, just as it had claimed everyone before me, and just as it would claim everyone after. Vincent's gaze softened, just for a moment, as if he were pitying me. "You'll remember. Eventually. You'll remember everything, but it won't matter. You'll still be here." And that was the truth. The building didn't need my memories. It didn't need my identity. It simply needed me to stay, to remain. The door slammed shut behind me, sealing me in, and I was left alone in the dim, flickering light. The whispering voices returned, louder now, swirling around me like a storm. "Welcome back. You've always been here." The walls shifted once more, and the hallway twisted, turning in on itself. The building was rearranging itself, reshaping to fit the next version of me, the next memory of me. I was no longer just a visitor. I was now a part of its history, a part of its never-ending loop. And as I stood there, frozen and helpless, I knew one thing for sure: I would never leave. The bill for my stay would never be paid. Because in this place, the cost of living was too high, and the price of escape was beyond reach. And so, I would stay. Forever. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.